The ring landed on the table with a soft thud. 7 years in a single gesture. She had just declared that he had always been a shadow and chosen the golden-haired handsome man by the window. No one in the room knew that for 9 years he had secretly borne the curse of her lineage so that she could sleep at night. Ian Ravenlock stands in the middle of the Holloway's living room, staring at his fingers. A strip of skin is turning white on his ring finger. Thin, precise, like the mark left by a rope he'd held for too long. 12 people stand in silence around him. Seryn's mother holds her back straight. Her father warms a glass by the fireplace. The maid stands frozen with a tray. And Cameron Ashton by the window, golden, calm, with the face of a man to whom all this is as natural as breathing. Seryn stands opposite him, tall, fair-haired, beautiful with that refined beauty they call breed in Veilguard. She speaks her words evenly, as if reading the terms of a contract. He is always a shadow. He is always tired. He is always there for others' misfortune, but not for their joy. Without malice, without tears, with a slight tilt of his head, as if explaining the obvious to a dimwit. And Ian listens, and he remembers. For 3 years she hadn't had any migraines. For 3 years she slept without nightmares. For 3 years she woke up feeling light and sang in the mornings with a clear voice. And not once did she ask why he turned pale by evening, why his hands shake after every visit, why he has a dry cough from October through spring. The Holloway family curse. Heavy, ancient, smelling of wet iron and burnt wormwood. He's been drawing it out of her since he was 14, quietly, at night, into himself. That's what the Revens, that's how his grandfather did it. That's how his father did it until he died at 43. A line of the cursed. Silent vessels for others' pain. No ballads are sung about them. Ian tears his gaze away from the ring. He looks at Seryn, at Cameron, at her mother, who's already almost smiling. He could say it, right now, in front of everyone, that without him, Seryn will stop sleeping in a month, that the migraines will return, that her voice will crack on the high notes, that Cameron, with all her gold, won't take what has been in the Holloway's blood for 300 years. He could strike her with this truth and watch her face tremble. But Ian remains silent. He bows, briefly, dryly, the way one bows when leaving someone else's house for good. He turns around, walks past the maid, past the door with the carved birds he'd considered his own for 7 years. He steps out into the garden. The rain hits his face immediately. Light, cold, October rain. Mud sticks to the soles of his shoes, and with every step, something in his chest lets go. Not pain, not anger. It's as if a taut string, one he'd pulled tight at 14 and never loosened, not even at night, suddenly snaps. He exhales. For the first time in 9 years, he breathes deeply, and his chest aches. It aches from disuse. At the gate, he places his hand on the wet stone. Rain runs down where the ring used to be. The white streak darkens before his eyes. And he thinks of the northern mark, of the Coldford garrison on the border with Holgrave, of the villages from which people are fleeing, of the where the water is turning foul, about the children born with gray eyes without pupils. No one there knows him. Not as Seryn's fiancée, not as the last of the Ravenlocks, not as a shadow, just as a man who knows how to lift curses. And that's enough. In the morning, he stands in his manor. 3 rooms, a library, a stable for a single horse. He pulls his grandfather's herbarium out of the chest. It's heavy, bound in leather, with notes from 4 generations in the margins. His own entries come last, in small handwriting, neater than his grandfather's. The herbarium goes into his travel bag, followed by his supplies. Candles, salt, thread, 3 skeins of wool, rusty nails from the pantry. Junk by ordinary people's standards. Without it, Ravenlock doesn't work. The horse, Dimmock, glances out from his stall with that weary look that says he'd rather stay home. Ian strokes his muzzle. He says they're heading north. Dimmock snorts. Ian takes that as consent. As they ride out, he doesn't look back. And that's harder than it seems. Behind him lies his home. The garden where he used to read every summer. The graves of his father and grandfather on the hill behind the church. But memory isn't a chain. You can carry memory with you. The road north cuts through 3 counties. Fields, villages, inns that smell of ale and wet wool. And the landscape changes day by day. The greenery fades. The grass withers before its time. The trees bend with twisted trunks as if invisible hands were pulling them toward the ground. Ian recognizes this smell, not with his nose, with his skin. It tingles at his fingertips. Iron settles on his tongue. He runs his hand along the bark by the roadside and feels a thin layer of corruption. Old. Deep. Like silt at the bottom of a river. Holgrave is leaking. 200 years ago, the Queen of Veilguard tried to curse an entire enemy army. She failed. The curse seeped into the earth, and it has been creeping ever since. Year after year. The northern marches are dying quietly, without ballads, without heroes. The crown sends brilliant warriors here with gleaming swords. They slay the cursed creatures. They earn medals. They return to the capital, and the land continues to rot. Because you can't cure a disease by killing its symptoms. On the 6th day, Ian stops in a nameless village. 3 houses, a well, an old woman by the fence. She looks at him with cloudy eyes and says nothing. He asks how far it is to Coldford. 2 days if you don't make any detours. Then she adds that he'd be better off not going. It's a bad place. The children are sick. The livestock is dying. The captain is a good man, but there's little he can do. Ian nods. He rides on, and behind him remains a thin layer of corruption covering everything. On the walls, on the fence, on her hands. He could remove that layer right now, but he remembers his grandfather's rule. First find the source, then treat the branches. Otherwise, you'll drown in endless work and never reach the root. On the 7th day, as evening falls, Coldford comes into view. A garrison at the edge of the world. Stone walls, wooden roofs, smoke rising from the chimneys, a low gray sky. Horses at their tethers, soldiers on the walls, and the smell. Ian closes his eyes for a second. A curse hangs over the town. Not a fresh one, a very old one. In layers, like growth rings on a tree stump. Each layer is someone's scream, someone's death, someone's fear ingrained in the stone. He opens his eyes. The guard at the gate stares at him without interest. He asks who and why. Ian says he's a curse breaker and has come to work. The guard snorts. They send smart Alecs like that every 6 months, and they all leave after 2 weeks. Ian replies that he wasn't sent. He came on his own. The guard looks a little more closely, at the pale face, at the dark circles under his eyes, at the old horse, at the bags stuffed with who knows what. He shrugs and lets him through. Ian rides into Coldford and breathes in the air. Heavy, gray, sickly, familiar. The room above the herbalist's shop smelled of dried mint and dust. A narrow bed, a table, a chair, a window facing the street. Ian set the bags in the corner and sat down on the bed. The springs creaked. He looked up at the ceiling. A crack ran from wall to wall like the bed of a dried-up river. The shopkeeper came up behind him. Eileen Marsh, 26 years old, a weather-beaten face, long arms, an apron over a simple dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She said the room cost 3 pennies a week, that breakfast was downstairs, that if he made noise at night, she'd kick him out. Ian said he was quiet. She looked at him with that look people get a second before a diagnosis is made. Then she nodded and left. Ian lay down. He closed his eyes. The earth hummed beneath him, quietly, steady, like a toothache that won't let up. He could feel every layer of decay beneath Coldford. Old, long-standing, fused with the stone of the foundations. He fell asleep to that hum and woke up to it as well. Mornings in Coldford began early. Ian went down to the shop. Eileen was already working. She was grinding herbs in a mortar, drying roots, arranging little bags on the shelves. He stopped at the counter and asked for some tea. She poured him a mug without looking up. He took a sip and froze. The tea had St. John's wort added to it, a slight bitter aftertaste. He asked if she'd prepared the blend herself. She said yes. He asked if she knew that St. John's wort in such quantities dulls the skin's sensitivity. She paused. She looked at him. She asked how he knew that. He said it was from his grandfather, the herbalist. That St. John's wort is good for the blues, but if you drink it every day, you stop feeling the first signs of damage on your hands. And in a place like Coldford, that's dangerous. Eileen set the mortar down on the table. Slowly. She was looking at him, and he could see something. Painful. She said she'd keep it in mind. Her voice was steady. Too steady. Ian finished his tea and left. He walked down Coldford's main street. A small town. Barracks, stables, shops, a tavern, a blacksmith shop, the infirmary at the end of the street. People looked at him without curiosity. A newcomer, pale, thin, wearing a coat out of season. Just another smart aleck from the capital who'll be gone in 2 weeks. He reached the infirmary. The door was open. Inside, it smelled of sickness and damp stone. 3 beds. 2 were empty. A girl lay on the third. Small, about 8 years old. Dark hair was scattered across the pillow. Her face was pale, almost blue. Her eyes were closed. She was breathing so faintly it was barely noticeable. Her chest rose and fell, as if even that were a struggle for her. A man was sitting on a chair nearby. He was large, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from stone. The Captain Commandant of Coldford, Holt Barrow. He didn't look at Ian. He was looking at his daughter. Ian stood in the doorway. He looked at the girl. Then he closed his eyes. Then he opened them. He walked over to the cot. He stood beside it. Holt raised his head. He asked who he was. Ian said he was a curse breaker, that he'd arrived yesterday, that he wanted to see the girl. Holt looked at him for a long time. The captain's face betrayed no emotion. His daughter had been lying unconscious for 4 months. The garrison doctor said it was exhaustion. The healer from the capital said it was weak blood. Neither had helped. Holt asked what Ian was going to do. Ian said he would just take a look first. He held his hand over the girl. Without touching her, his palm was 2 fingers' width from her forehead. He slowly moved it downward. Forehead, throat, chest, stomach. He paused at her chest. His fingers twitched. He felt it. Thick, cold, smelling of wet earth and old bones. A curse sat inside her like a splinter. Not an illness, not weak blood. A curse, an old one, from the earth, from beneath the building itself. He opened his eyes, looked at Holt, said he needed cat fur, a rusty nail, and salt water from the well by the east gate. Not the west one, the east one. That's important. Holt looked at him as if he were crazy. Ian held his gaze. He was used to looks like that. His whole life had been a string of such looks. He asks for strange things. People look at him like that. Then they bring it. Then they stop looking at him like that. Holt stood up. He went out. He came back 20 minutes later. He brought everything. Ian sat down by the cot. He wound the fur around the nail, tightly, layer by layer. He lowered it into a bowl of salt water. He waited. He pulled it out. He placed it on the girl's chest. He covered it with his palm. and he began to pull. It didn't look pretty. There was no light. There were no signs. There were no incantations. There was a man sitting by the child's bed with his eyes closed, his face turning pale. 1 minute, 2, 10, 20. Ian felt the curse flowing through him. Cold, heavy, with a taste of iron and rot. It flowed from the girl through his hand into the nail, through the wool into the water. Slowly, drop by drop. He took his time. To rush meant to tear it apart. To tear it apart meant a part would remain in the child and grow even deeper. He broke it down, layer by layer, fiber by fiber, thread by thread. His body ached. His joints throbbed. A throbbing pain pulsed in his temples. By the 30th minute, he could no longer feel the fingers of his left hand. By the 40th, the taste of blood filled his mouth. He swallowed. He continued. The last layer peeled away like a scab from a wound. Ian opened his eyes. He pulled the nail out from under his palm. It was black, not rusty, black. The hair crumbled to dust at the first touch. The water in the bowl had turned murky and smelled like a swamp. He placed the nail on the table. He looked at Holt. The captain was sitting on a chair by the wall. He hadn't moved for the entire 40 minutes. Ian told him there was an old mass grave beneath the barracks, that he'd show him exactly where tomorrow, that the girl had been sleeping next to the wall behind which the bones lay, that the corruption had seeped through the stone for years, that Maya had simply happened to be the closest of all. Holt didn't answer. He was looking at his daughter. Ian stood up. His legs wouldn't hold him. He leaned against the wall. He stood there for a moment. He straightened up. He walked out. He made his way to Eileen's shop. He climbed the stairs. He lay down on the bed. He stared at a crack in the ceiling. His hands were shaking. The taste of someone else's death lingered in his mouth. But the girl would live. By evening, all of Coldford knew. Maya Barrow opened her eyes. She asked for bread. She asked for her father. Holt Barrow sat by her bedside, holding her hand. The man who hadn't cried at his wife's funeral was now crying in the infirmary hallway, his back turned to the wall. The garrison soldiers stood by the door and said nothing. They didn't know what to say. They had seen the heroes from the capital come and go. They had seen the healers throw up their hands. How doctors spoke clever words and did nothing. And then a pale, thin man came in with a rusty nail and a piece of wool, and the girl opened her eyes. Ian found out about all this that morning. Eileen came up to him with breakfast. She set the tray on the table. Bread, porridge, tea, no St. John's wort. She said Maya was fine, that the whole town was talking about nothing but him, that Captain Holt had asked for his name 3 times. Ian sat on the bed. He stared at the tray. He couldn't remember the last time someone had brought him breakfast. At the Ravenlocks, he'd always cooked for himself. At the Holloways, they'd set the table for him, but those were Seryn's servants, and he'd always felt like a guest. And here, a woman he'd known for just 1 day had brought him food because he'd helped a child. Just like that. He said thank you. His voice sounded strange. Eileen nodded and left. Ian ate every last crumb. Then he sat there with an empty mug in his hands, thinking that maybe coming here hadn't been a mistake after all. For 3 days after the incident with Maya, Ian didn't leave his room. His body was paying the price for the work, just as it always did. His joints ached. His head was splitting with a dull, throbbing pain from his temples to the back of his head. He lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. A crack in the ceiling branched out like a tree. He'd studied every line of it over those 3 days. Eileen came up twice a day, in the morning with porridge, in the evening with soup. She'd set the tray down. She'd touch his forehead with the back of her hand. She didn't ask how he was feeling. She was the kind of person who didn't ask questions when she could see the answer with her own eyes. On the 4th day, he went downstairs. His legs held him up. His head was buzzing, but it was bearable. He stepped outside, and the first person he met was a soldier. Young, red-headed. The soldier stopped. He looked at him. He said, "You're that damned man, aren't you?" Ian said, "Yes." The soldier hesitated. Then he said his mother lived in a village 2 hours north. Her cows had been dying for 3 months. Could he take a look? Ian said he could. The soldier nodded. He walked away. And Ian stood there on the street, realizing that this was only the beginning. By lunchtime, 4 more had approached him. One man's father was sick. Another's water in the cellar was going bad. A third man's son woke up screaming every night. The fourth just had a question. His wife said there was an evil spot in the garden behind the house. Could the cursebreaker come by and check it out? Ian took notes. He had a notebook, a small one with a leather cover. He wrote down names, addresses, and complaints and jotted notes in the margins. That was his way of working, not trying to tackle everything at once, not rushing from house to house. Write it down, sort it out, prioritize by urgency. Children first, then the elderly, then livestock and water, then the land. He returned to the shop that evening. Eileen was standing behind the counter, sorting through dried roots. He sat down on a chair by the wall and opened his notebook. He read his notes, muttering something to himself under his breath. Eileen set a mug of tea in front of him. He didn't notice. She coughed. He looked up, saw the mug, said thank you. She asked what he was muttering. He said he was counting, that within a 2-hour radius of Coldford, there were at least 6 spots where corruption was seeping out. And that was just based on what he'd been told in a single day. There were probably 20 actual points, or 30. She asked if he could handle all this on his own. He paused. He said no, but he could start. The next morning, he walked out the gate. The first village, 2 hours north. The mother of that red-haired soldier. A little house with 3 windows, a fence, a cowshed. He didn't go to the cows. He stood in the middle of the yard. He closed his eyes. He ran his palms through the air, slowly, like a blind man feeling the face of a stranger. The corruption was coming from under the cowshed, weak, subtle, but constant, like a dripping faucet. He walked around the cowshed. He found the spot. A corner. The foundation had sunk. A chill seeped from the crack. Not winter's chill, something else. He dropped to his knees. He ran his fingers over the stone. An old burial site. Not a grave, something smaller. Someone had once buried a cursed object here, maybe 100 years ago, maybe 200. The object had long since rotted away, but a trace remained, and it was oozing, slowly, year after year. He asked the landlady for a shovel. He dug for 20 minutes. He found it. A fragment of something metallic, blackened, with green spots on it. He didn't touch it. He took a small bag of salt out of his bag. He sprinkled it around the fragment. He took out a piece of woolen thread. He tied it around it. He took out a nail. He drove it into the ground nearby. He sat down. He placed his hand on the nail. He pulled. 10 minutes, no more. The curse was weak, old. It drained into the nail easily, like water into sand. He pulled the nail out, black at the tip. He wrapped it in a rag. He placed the shard from the ground in another rag. He told the farmer's wife that the cows would recover in a week, that the shard he would take it and destroy it, that it would be best to fill in the hole and tamp it down. The farmer's wife stood there staring at him with wide eyes. She asked how much she owed him. Ian said nothing. She froze. He could tell she didn't believe him. In Veilguard, a cursebreaker's work is paid for in silver. Healers in the capital take gold. He said that if she wanted to, she could give him some bread for the road. She gave him bread, and cheese, and dried meat, and apples, and a bunch of garlic. He walked back, eating bread and cheese as he went, thinking he hadn't eaten anything tastier in a long time. That evening, at Eileen's shop, he laid out his notebook on the table. He began to draw a map, a rough one, from memory. Coldford in the center, villages all around, the spots where he'd found the corruption, lines marking possible underground paths. Eileen stood nearby and watched. He explained to her that the corruption wasn't random. It flows like water, through underground channels, through cracks in the rock, along old roads and trails. If you know where it's seeping from, you can predict where it will go next. She listened. She asked questions. Smart questions. Precise ones. He answered every one. And on the third question, he paused. He looked at her. He asked if she had any experience with herbs for warding off the curse. She said she had a little. That she'd tried to learn. That there weren't many books. That no one had taught her. That she was on her own. He nodded. He opened his grandfather's herb book, found the page. He showed it to her. He explained that common mint is useless against curses, but mint that grows near running water absorbs traces of the curse, and the color of the leaves can indicate the degree of contamination in the water source. Dark veins mean a mild curse. Black tips mean a serious one. Curled leaves mean it's dangerous, and it's best to go there without protection. Eileen listened. She didn't nod. She didn't say she understood. She was taking it all in. He saw her eyes moving across the page, how she was memorizing it, how something inside her was unfolding. He showed her 3 more pages, about St. John's wort and its connection to curses, about wormwood as an indicator, about how to distinguish a simple illness from a curse by the smell of the patient's sweat. She listened for an hour. Then she said she had to close the shop. He nodded. He closed the herb shop. He stood up. She stood by the counter and didn't move. He asked if everything was all right. She said yes. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched around the edge of her apron. She said that 5 years ago, her brother had died, that the garrison doctor had said it was a fever, but it had been a curse. And if she'd known back then what he'd shown her today in just 1 hour, her brother would still be alive. Ian stood there, not knowing what to say. He didn't know how to comfort people. He knew how to pull curses from children, find curses in wells, and make amulets from rusty nails. But to stand before a woman who had just told him about her dead brother and find the right words, that he didn't know how to do. He said he'd show her more, every evening if she wanted, that she could copy from the herb book, that knowledge shouldn't die with a single person. She nodded. He went upstairs, lay down on the bed, stared at the crack in the wall, and heard Eileen crying quietly downstairs in the pantry among her herbs. He didn't go down. Not because he didn't want to, because he knew that some tears must be alone, without witnesses, without comfort. Just cry it out and move on. In the morning, she was standing behind the counter as usual, with her back straight, with her sleeves rolled up. She poured him some tea, without St. John's wort. Next to the mug lay a notebook. Blank. New. She said it was for taking notes, that his notebook was too small, that he needed a bigger one. Ian took the notebook. He opened it. He ran his hand over the blank page. He said thank you. She nodded and went back to work. He sat there with the notebook in his hands, realizing that this was the beginning of something. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, just simple. Someone had given him a notebook because his old one was too small. That was all. But for him, it was a lot. On his 10th day in Coldford, Ian met Rin Sora. He hadn't planned it. He was walking to the southern village to investigate a complaint about the water in a well. A trail through the woods. Old trees, moss on the rocks. Silence. Too quiet. No birds, no wind in the branches. He stopped. He listened. Not with his ears, with his skin. His fingers tingled. There was something to the right of the trail. He stepped off the path, took 3 steps into the woods, and saw her. She was crouching by the roots of an old oak tree, lean, with short-cropped hair, wearing deer-hide pants and a jacket, 2 knives at her belt. She was staring at the ground in front of her. There lay a dead fox, not just dead, blackened, with its mouth wide open. Its eyes had bulged out. Its fur was matted into clumps. Ian stepped closer. He crouched down beside it. He ran his hand over the carcass. Corruption, severe, fresh. The fox had run into the infected area and never made it out. He looked at the woman. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark. Her face was calm. She asked who he was. He told her. She nodded. She said her name was Wren, a scout, that she'd found this fox an hour ago and had been waiting because she knew someone would come. She hadn't expected it so soon. He asked why she'd been waiting. She said this was already the 4th dead creature this week, all in this sector. This hadn't happened before. Something is changing. Ian stood up. He looked around. The trees surrounding the oak had black spots on their bark. The grass under his feet wasn't withered, it was dead, gray, brittle. He walked 10 steps further, 20. The spots on the trees were getting denser. The grass was disappearing. The ground was bare, dark. He stopped, crouched down, placed his palm on the ground, and pulled it away. The corruption stung his fingers like a burn. He looked at his palm. Red spots on the fingertips, like from stinging nettles. He returned to Wren. He said that a new source was opening up here, fresh, powerful. That this wasn't the old curse seeping up from the depths. It was something else. Something was rising. Wren stood up. She brushed the dirt off her knees. She asked if he could show her on the map. He took out his notebook. He drew a dot. She looked at it. She took out her own map, a thin one, on parchment, a professional scout's map marked with trails and landmarks. She aligned his dot with her map. She marked the spot. She said she'd show him 3 more places where she'd found dead animals. She had no one to tell about this because the garrison didn't consider dead foxes a threat. They were used to swords and beasts. A dead fox was no problem to them. They set off together. Wren led the way. Quickly, confidently. She knew every tree, every rock, every bend in the trail. He followed behind and felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The second spot. A clearing. Dead grass all around. 15 paces across. A rock in the center. He placed his hand on the rock. Warm. Not from the sun, from within. He marked it on the map. Third location. A stream. The water looked clear, but he dipped his finger in and felt it. Bitterness. Not in his mouth, in his skin. He wiped his hand on his pant leg. He marked it. Fourth location. A ravine. It smelled here. Wren said the smell had appeared 2 weeks ago. Wet iron and something sweet. Ian knew that smell. That's what old corruption smells like when it rises to the surface. Like pus from a wound. He stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down. The ground at the bottom was black. He wrote it down in his notebook. They walked back, in silence. Wren didn't say anything unnecessary. He appreciated that. She asked only one thing. She said she'd heard about Maya, that he'd pulled her out. He said yes. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she didn't know how to do that. That among the northern clans where she came from, a connection with the spirits of the earth was valued. And she didn't have that connection. That her clan considered her empty. He looked at her. She walked on without turning back. Her back was straight. Her stride was steady. Her voice was calm. But he heard what lay behind her words. He thought for 3 steps. Then he told her that she wasn't empty, that she was quiet, that they were different things. She didn't answer. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. They walked to Coldford in silence. At the gate, they parted ways. Wren went toward the barracks. Ian went to Eileen's shop. He spread the map out on the table. He marked 4 new points. He connected them with lines. He looked at it. The lines converged in one direction, northeast, toward Holgrave. He sat there staring at the map, realizing that the scale of the problem was greater than he'd thought. Much greater. The next morning, a mug of hot water was sitting by the shop door. Just a mug on the threshold. No note, no explanation. Eileen said she'd seen Wren put it there and leave. Ian picked up the mug. The water was hot, with a sprig of mint. He drank it standing by the door. He looked out at the empty morning street in Coldford, and he thought it was a strange feeling. When someone brings you hot water not because you asked for it, not because you paid for it, not because you owe anyone anything. Just like that. He finished it, set the mug down, went back to work. For the next 2 weeks, he cleared the land, village after village, House after house. 3 villages within a 3-hour radius of Coldford. Wren guided him through the territory. She showed him the trails. She showed him the places where the earth was sick. She showed him villages he wouldn't have reached on his own even in a month. They worked out a system. She went ahead and marked the spots. He followed behind and checked them. In the evening, they checked their maps at Eileen's. Eileen took notes. 3 people, a notebook, 2 maps. It wasn't an army, not an order, not a heroic expedition. It was what it was, and that was enough. By the end of the 3rd week, Ian was sitting at Eileen's place that evening. Tired, pale. His fingers trembled from the work. He drank tea and said nothing. Eileen sat across from him, copying from a herbarium. Wren came in after her shift. She sat down beside him. She didn't say a word. She took out her map and began making new notes. 3 people at one table, each doing their own thing, in silence, together. Ian looked up and watched them. 2 women sitting next to him, not because they had nothing else to do, but because they'd chosen to be there. He didn't know what to make of it. For 23 years of his life, he'd always been surrounded by people who were there out of duty, out of family ties, out of engagement, out of habit, but not by choice. He lowered his eyes to his mug. The tea had gone cold. He finished it cold. Eileen stood up and poured him some hot tea, without asking. He said thank you. She nodded and went back to writing. Wren slid a map toward him. She tapped a spot in the northeast with her finger. She said they needed to check it out tomorrow. He nodded and thought that he had a tomorrow. That for the first time in a long time, he knew what he would be doing tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a week from now, and that there would be people by his side. It was new, unfamiliar, scary, but good. At the end of the 3rd week, Captain Holt Barrow invited Ian to his place for the first time. Not to his office, not to the barracks, to his home. A small house on the edge of the garrison. 2 stories, stone walls, a door with a heavy bolt. Holt opened it himself. He led Ian into the room. A table, 2 benches, a fireplace, a bottle on the table, 2 mugs. Holt sat down. He pointed to the bench across from him. Ian sat down. Holt poured. He didn't ask if Ian wanted a drink. He just poured it. Ian took the mug, took a sip. Strong, hot. It burned his throat. Holt drank in silence. Ian drank in silence. He didn't know why he'd been summoned. He wasn't used to situations like this, sitting across from a big, heavy man and drinking with him in silence. Holt spoke first. He said that Maya was drawing, every day, with colored chalk. That today she'd drawn a map of Coldford with markings. Red dots were dangerous places. Blue ones were good. Green ones were where Ian lived. Ian didn't know what to say. Holt continued. He said his wife had died 6 years ago, in childbirth. That Maya doesn't remember her mother. That he's been on the mission for 10 years. That he'd sent reports to the capital every year about the curse, about the villages, about the children. That not a single report received a reply. That they'd sent him heroes, young, handsome warriors with gleaming swords who chopped down the cursed creatures, posed for photos against a backdrop of corpses, and then left. That not a single one of them looked at the water in the wells. Not a single one checked the ground beneath the houses. Not a single one sat down by his daughter's bed. He fell silent, took a sip. Ian sat quietly. Holt said he didn't know how to say such things, that he was a soldier and that soldiers don't say such things, but that he had to say it. He said thank you. One word, a heavy one. He said it looking Ian straight in the eyes, and Ian saw in those eyes what he saw in the mirror every morning. Weariness. Not physical, the other kind. When you've been doing the right thing for years and no one notices. When you're holding up a wall and the wall doesn't fall and everyone thinks it's standing on its own. He recognized that weariness. It was his own. He wanted to say something. Something right, something worthy of the moment. But the words wouldn't come. He didn't know how to accept gratitude. His whole life had been built on doing and leaving, quietly, unnoticed, without words. He clutched the mug with both hands. He looked into the fire in the fireplace and said the only thing that came to mind. He said he'd tell Holt about the grave beneath the barracks, that show him where to dig, that it would be best to do it before winter, because in winter the curse burrows deeper and it will be harder to reach it. Holt nodded. He understood. That Ian didn't know how to talk about his feelings, that he spoke through his work, that his thank you was when he came and did it. They finished the bottle in 2 hours. In those 2 hours, Holt told him more about the town than Ian would have learned in a month. He said that the villages to the northeast were emptying out the fastest, that 4 families had left in the past year, that those who remained were either too poor or too stubborn, that children were being born weak, that livestock was dying more often, that the soldiers at the garrison were falling ill with strange diseases that couldn't be treated with conventional remedies, that 2 years ago he'd buried his best sergeant, a healthy man, 35 years old, who'd simply gone to bed and never woken up. The doctor said it was a heart condition, but Holt knew it wasn't his heart. It was the mark. Ian listened. He took it all in, every fact, every name, every village. By the time he left, it was late, dark. The stars above Coldford shone low and bright. He walked down the empty street, thinking about how Holt Barrow had held this wall alone for 10 years, without help, without recognition, without hope that anyone would come. And he kept holding it, because behind the wall were his daughter, and his soldiers, and the villages that weren't yet empty. In the morning, Ian went to the barracks. He showed Holt the spot, the northeast corner, by the wall, where Maya's bunk had stood. Holt brought 4 soldiers with shovels. They dug. 3 cubits down, they found bones, old, yellowish, lots of them. A mass grave, from some long-forgotten skirmish. No one remembered when. No one knew they were here. The barracks had been built right on top of it. Ian climbed down into the pit. He ran his hands over the bones. Corruption oozed from them like water from a sponge. Not malevolent, not intentional. It was simply that the dead had lain there, unburied according to the rules, and their pain and fear had seeped into the earth, slowly poisoning everything around them. He worked for 3 hours. He drew the corruption out of every bone, through the nails, through the wool, through the salt, methodically, layer by layer. By the end, he was shaking. Eileen waited upstairs with water and a blanket. She already knew that after work he'd be pale and shaking, and that he'd need water and rest, and that she shouldn't ask any questions. The bones were reburied outside the city walls, properly, with a ceremony. The garrison priest recited the words. Holt stood nearby and said nothing. Ian stood a little to the side, watching. Maya stood next to her father and held his hand. She wasn't sick anymore. Her cheeks had turned rosy. Her eyes sparkled. She looked at Ian across the courtyard. She waved to him, with her little hand. Seriously, the way you wave to an adult you respect. He waved back. After the reburial, Maya came to see him at Eileen's shop. She brought a drawing, a map of Coldford. Red dots, blue dots, a green dot where the shop was, and a little man next to the green dot. Slender, with dark hair, holding something in his hand. He asked what the little man was holding. She said it was a nail, because he always carries nails with him. He hung the drawing on the wall above his bed. Eileen saw it and said nothing. The next day, Maya came again. And the day after that. She came every day after lunch. She would sit down at the table. She would draw. Sometimes she would ask questions. What is a curse? Why is the earth sick? Why do nails turn black? He would answer, in simple words, without fear, without condescension. She listened with the seriousness of an 8-year-old child who already knows that the world is dangerous and wants to understand why. Once she asked if she, too, could become a curse breaker. He paused. He said that it required a gift, and that a gift was passed down through the bloodline. But that one could learn to recognize a curse without the gift. That Eileen was learning. That Ren was learning in his own way. That if Maya wanted to, she could too. Her eyes lit up. She said she wanted to. He nodded. He took a pebble out of his pocket, smooth, round, a river stone, and gave it to her. He told her it was her first tool, that a stone from running water could sense a curse. If you place it in your palm and hold it up to a tainted spot, it will turn cold. She clenched the stone in her fist. She looked up at him. He saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in the eyes of adults. Complete, unconditional trust. It was harder than bearing a curse. Harder because he didn't know if he deserved it. Captain Holt stood in the doorway, watching them, his daughter and the pale man who had given her the stone and was patiently explaining how the world worked. Holt stood there, thinking that over the past 10 years, the Crown had sent 23 heroes to the mark, with swords, with medals, with titles, and not a single one of them had sat down next to his daughter and given her a pebble. He turned away, went into his study, took out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write a report. His first in 3 years. Not to the Chancellery, not to the Order, addressed to the King. He wrote that there was a man working on the Northern March, that this man accomplishes more in a week than all the heroes sent there in a year, that his name is Ian Ravenlock, that he is the last of his house, that the Crown must know his name. He sealed the letter. He handed it to a messenger. The messenger rode south. Ian didn't know any of this. He was sitting in the shop, showing Maya how to hold a pebble above the ground. Eileen stood nearby and smiled, for the first time in all the days he'd been here. Not at him, not at Maya. She was just smiling, because for the first time in 5 years, her shop didn't smell only of mint and dust. It smelled of something else, something she had forgotten. Hope. In the 5th week, a letter arrived in Coldford. Not for Ian. One had come for Ian too, but he didn't know that yet. The first letter was from Seryn Holloway. A white envelope, the Holloway family seal, blue wax with the imprint of a songbird. Ian stood at Eileen's counter, holding the envelope with both hands. He looked at the seal, at his name written in her handwriting, neat letters with long tails. She always wrote that way, beautiful, careful, as if every word were a little ornament. He turned the envelope over in his hands. He didn't open it. He put it in the trunk, the very same trunk he'd arrived with, between his grandfather's herb book and the spare nails. Eileen saw it. She didn't ask. Ren saw it. She didn't ask either. But that evening, when the 3 of them were sitting at the table playing cards, Ren said his face had turned into that kind of expression. Ian asked what kind. She said it was like a dog's when you show it a stick but don't throw it. Eileen snorted. Ian looked at Ren. Ren looked at him without a smile. Dark eyes. A steady gaze. She wasn't joking. She was stating a fact. He said it was a letter from his ex-fiancée. Ren nodded. She said she understood. She said, "The stick." Eileen coughed and went into the pantry. Ian could hear her laughing behind the door. He sat there and thought he wasn't used to this. To people who noticed his face. To people who joked in front of him. To people who laughed in the pantry because of him. It was strange. Nice and strange at the same time. For the next 2 days he worked. A village in North. A family with a sick old man. A grandfather, 70 years old. He couldn't get up from the bench. A cough. His legs wouldn't hold him. The doctor said it was old age. Ian came in, sat down beside him, ran his hand over him. It was old age, but beneath it lay a curse. Subtle, cunning. It masqueraded as age-related ailments. It blended in with them. It hid in the joints, in the lungs, under the skin. He worked for 3 hours, pulling it out thread by thread. The old man lay there, wheezing. His granddaughter stood by the door, wringing her hands. Ian finished. He stood up. He said the old man would be walking in a week. That old age wasn't going anywhere, but his legs would hold him up. The granddaughter looked at him as if he'd said a second sun would rise tomorrow. He went out. He walked to the next house. The next house had a different problem. A well. Water with an iron taste. Not dangerous for adults, but it made the children weak. He checked the well. He found a crack in the stonework 4 elbows deep, 4 cubits deep. The contamination was seeping through the crack from the underground layer. He couldn't clean out the underground layer. It was too deep. There was too much of it. But he could make a filter. He took 3 stones out of his bag, river stones, smooth ones, and wrapped each one in woolen thread. He soaked them in salt water. He lowered them into the well at different depths. The stones would absorb the taint from the water. Once a month, they would need to be retrieved and replaced. He explained to the owner how to do this. The owner nodded and repeated the instructions. Ian made him repeat them 3 times, because his children's health depended on it. On the way back, he stopped on a hill. He looked at the view. A gray sky, yellow grass, dark patches of forest, villages like dots on a piece of cloth, smoke from chimneys. He stood there and counted. In 3 weeks of work, he had cleansed 6 houses, 3 wells, 1 mass grave. He'd placed protective charms in 4 families' homes. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. The area stretched for dozens of leagues in every direction. Dozens of villages, hundreds of houses, thousands of people. And he was all alone. He walked down from the hill. He headed toward Coldford. He thought as he walked. He needed people, not curse casters. There aren't any of those left. He needed eyes and hands, people who knew how to see, to notice, to distinguish. He'd already been teaching Eileen. She was a quick learner. In 3 weeks, she learned to determine the degree of water contamination by the herbs. Not perfectly, but enough to sound the alarm. Wren had a different skill. She read the earth, not the corruption within it, but the earth itself. Where it was sinking, where the color was changing, where the grass grew differently. She did it instinctively, without training. Her northern blood gave her what the clan considered emptiness, but Ian saw as a gift of a different kind. That evening, he told Eileen and Wren that he wanted to start teaching people, not the craft of curses, but the craft of detection. What if every village had at least one person who knew how to test the water and the earth? Then they could catch the corruption before it struck the people. Eileen said that made sense. Wren said it was a lot of work. Ian said he knew, but that the alternative was him being the only one doing it for the whole region until he burned out. Wren looked at him for a long time. Then she said, okay, that she'd guide him, that she had routes and maps, and that she knew people in the villages, people who could be trusted, who would listen, who would actually do something instead of just nodding. They started the following week. The first village, the old woman. A sturdy woman in her 50s. Her hands were calloused. Her gaze was direct. Ian showed her how to test the water with mint, how to place a stone in her palm and hold it up to the well, how to tell by the color of the grass around the spring. She listened in silence. Then she repeated it. Exactly. Without mistakes. He left her the stone and a bunch of the right kind of mint. He told her that if the stone turned cold, she should send a messenger to Coldford, the second village. A shepherd, young, 20 years old, quiet, attentive. He had already noticed that his sheep were avoiding certain spots. Ian said that sheep sense a curse better than people do, that the shepherd was already doing half the work just by watching the flock. He taught him to read the animal's behavior like a map. If the flock avoids a spot, check it out. If the dogs whine near a certain rock, dig nearby. Third village, a miller, old, stubborn. He didn't believe it. He said that curse breakers were charlatans and that his mill had stood for 100 years and would stand for another 100. Ian didn't argue. He asked to see the mill. He walked through it. He found a spot by the right millstone where the wood had turned black on the inside. He showed it to the miller. He said that if it wasn't cleaned out, the millstone would crack within a year. The miller stared at the blackened wood. He touched it with his finger. His finger grew cold. He turned pale. Ian cleaned it out. 20 minutes. The miller stood nearby and said nothing. When Ian finished, the miller asked what he could do to keep it from happening again. Ian taught him. That evening, Wren sat on a rock by the Coldford gate and sharpened her knife. Ian sat down beside her. They were silent. She said the miller would tell everyone. That in a week, half the surrounding villages would know there was a curse-breaker in Mark who taught people for free. Ian said that was the plan. She looked at him from the side. She said he was strange. He asked in what way. She said that everyone she knew with power wanted to be feared or admired, but he wanted to be unnecessary. He thought for a moment. He said that was probably an accurate description. She chuckled. She went back to sharpening the knife. Then she said that was exactly why he would still be needed for a very long time. He didn't understand. She didn't explain. They sat on a rock and watched the sun set behind the northern hills. The sky was gray and pink at the same time. Beautiful. He thought he couldn't remember the last time he'd watched a sunset just like that, with nothing to do, with no purpose, just because it was beautiful. A letter arrived from Seryn, which Ian didn't open. He continued to scour the villages and began teaching the locals how to recognize corruption. An old woman, a shepherd, a miller. Wren became his constant guide through the mark. A system was taking shape for the early detection of corruption by the villages themselves. In the 7th week, Cameron Ashton left the capital and headed north. The whole of Waygard found out about it because Cameron Ashton never did anything quietly. Hero of the kingdom, darling of the court, Order of the Silver Lion, 2 cursed beasts slain to his credit, a face for ballads and portraits, a white horse, a blue cloak trimmed with gold, an entourage of 12 men. He was riding to save the northern march, and the whole world knew it. The news reached Coldford with a trade caravan. A soldier recounted it over dinner. Ian sat at a table in the tavern next to Holt and Wren. He listened. His expression didn't change. He took a sip from his mug. Holt looked at him. Ian said that Cameron was a good warrior. Holt snorted. Wren said that good warriors don't travel with 12 servants. Ian said nothing. His mind was elsewhere. Cameron was heading north through Westmore County. They would be waiting for him there. Feasts, honors, speeches. Then Hardmore County. More feasts, more honors. It would take him 2 months to reach Coldford, if he ever made it there at all, and didn't get stuck in some castle where the Lord's daughter would look at him with moist eyes. But along the way he would kill. Those damned beasts. The ones that crawl out of the ground. Big ones. Terrifying ones. With claws and fangs. He'll hack them down with his sword, and the people will cheer with delight. And no one will look down. No one will check the ground beneath the village he saved. No one will peer into the well. Because the creature is dead, and that means the danger has passed. That's what the capital thinks. That's what the court thinks. That's what all of Waygard thinks. That the curse is a creature that can be killed with a sword. Not a sickness of the earth that needs to be cured. Ian finished his mug. He stood up. He said he had to work. He went out. A cold evening lay outside. November had reached the border. Ian walked toward the shop, thinking about Cameron. Not with anger. The anger had faded long ago. Somewhere around the 3rd week in Coldford, he realized he wasn't angry at Cameron. Cameron was what they had made him. They taught him to chop. He was praised for chopping. He was given medals for chopping. And he chopped. It wasn't his fault that no one had taught him to look down. Ian thought about Seryn, about the letter in the chest, about the fact that in 2 months Cameron might end up here, in Coldford, in his Coldford, with Seryn, who was now his. And that thought stirred nothing inside him. Empty, quiet, like a burned-out house. He walked into the shop. Eileen was sitting at the table. A herbarium lay in front of her. She was copying it out, the 3rd notebook in recent weeks. He sat down across from her. She slid a mug of tea toward him. He took it. He drank. He was silent. She wrote. Then she looked up. She asked if he'd heard about Cameron. He nodded. She asked if he knew him. He paused. He said that Cameron was the man his ex-fiancée had chosen over him. Eileen didn't flinch. She kept looking at him. He said it had been a month and a half ago, that he'd taken off the ring, that he'd come here, that the letter in the trunk was from her. Eileen nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she said one thing. She said that when her brother died, she wore his shirt for half a year. She didn't. She wore it until it fell apart. And that when the shirt fell apart, she couldn't breathe for 2 days. And then she could. And it became easier. Not good, but easier. Ian looked at her. She went back to her notes. She didn't say anything else. He sat there thinking that she had just done something no one else had done. She hadn't offered comfort. She hadn't given advice. She hadn't said he'd find someone better or that time heals all wounds. She'd simply placed her pain next to his, silently, like placing one stone next to another. The next week, the news came. Cameron Ashton had killed that damned beast in Westmore County. A huge beast. Black fur. 3 pairs of eyes. As tall as 2 men. Cameron hacked it to pieces in front of a crowd. All of Westmore celebrated for 3 days. Ballads were already being written. Ian listened. He nodded. Then he asked the merchant who had brought the news in which village it had happened. The merchant told him. Ian found the village on the map. He marked it with a dot. He looked. The village stood right above one of the underground channels of corruption that he had mapped out. The creature hadn't emerged there by chance. It had emerged because corruption was building up below. And the creature was a symptom, not the disease. Cameron had killed the symptom. The corruption remained. In a month or 2, it would force a new creature out. Or it would poison the well. Or it would attack a child. Ian sat there staring at the map. Then he stood up. He told Wren they needed to go there. Wren asked where. He said to Westmore, to that village, to check what was left after Cameron. Wren said it was far, a 3-day journey. He said he knew. She said okay. They set out the next morning. Ian. Wren. 2 days along the trail, through withered grass, through gray hills, through villages where people came out to the road and watched. Some recognized him. The cursed one from Coldford, the very same one, the one who saved the captain's daughter, the one who fixed the well, the one who got old Tom back on his feet. Rumors spread through the mark like ripples on water, quietly, slowly, but surely. On the 3rd day, they reached the village, Westmore territory, richer than the mark. The houses were sturdier, the fences were taller, but there were traces. Ian saw them right away. The square in front of the tavern where Cameron had killed the beast. The ground had been dug up. The beast's blood had seeped into the soil. Around the square, trees stood with black spots on their bark. He walked through the village, slowly, with his eyes closed, hands at his sides. His fingers sensed it. The corruption was everywhere. Not strong, but constant. The creature had been sitting on the spring. It had been killed. The spring remained. He opened his eyes, looked at Wren, said there was enough work for 2 days. She nodded. They worked for 2 days. He found the spring beneath the square, an old crack in the bedrock. The corruption seeped from the depths. He couldn't seal the crack. It was too deep. But he could do the same thing he'd done with the wells, a filter. Stones wrapped in wool, placed at the right spots. He explained to the village elder how to replace the stones, once every 2 weeks. It was essential. The village elder listened and nodded. He was the kind of person who listened. Ian could see it in his eyes. On the way back, Wren said that he had just cleaned up after Cameron Ashton. Ian didn't answer. She said it would happen again, that Cameron would slay the creatures and reap the glory, and Ian would have to follow behind and clean up what was left. And no one would know. Ian said he didn't need them to know. Wren stopped, looked at him, said she did need them to know. That she didn't give a damn about him or his modesty. That people needed to know who was really healing their land. He stood under the gray sky and looked at her. She stood across from him. wiry, angry, with knives at her belt. Short hair, dark eyes. She was angry on his behalf, not at him, for him. He didn't know what to do about it. He said, "All right." She said that wasn't an answer. He said he didn't know what the right answer was. She turned and walked away. He followed her. They walked in silence all the way to Coldford. Cameron Ashton had ridden north and killed the accursed creature in Westmore, not realizing he'd left the source of the corruption beneath the village untouched. Ian and Wren reached the village and cleaned up what was left. Ian told Eileen about the broken engagement and about Seryn. For the first time, Wren openly got angry on Ian's behalf and because no one recognized his work. The second month on the mark, the village of Grey Ash. Ian stood by the well and looked down. The water was black. Not dark, black, like ink. A smell rose from the depths. Wet iron, rot, something sweet. The grass around the well was dead within a radius of 10 paces. The ground was gray, dry, crumbly. The village stood silent. 20 houses, half of them empty. People had left over the past year. Those who remained looked like shadows, pale, gaunt. An old woman at the house on the edge of the village coughed incessantly. A child of about 5 sat on the porch, staring with empty eyes. Not gray, not yet gray, but close. Ian ran his hand over the well and pulled it back. His palm burned. He looked at his hand. Red spots from his wrist to his fingertips. It wasn't a spring. It was a fault line. A crack in the ground through which corruption flowed from the depths in a torrent. Not in drops, in a torrent. He sat down on the edge of the well. He closed his eyes. He listened. The corruption hummed below, in layers, 10, 20, 30 layers. Each layer was a year. This fissure had been open for 30 years, and no one had known. He opened his eyes. He looked at Wren. She was standing nearby, waiting. He said this was a big one, that he'd need a week, maybe more, that he'd remove 1 layer a day, that if he tried to take it all at once, he'd die. Wren didn't argue. She knew him well enough not to argue when he spoke in that tone. They returned to Coldford. Ian gathered everything they needed: nails, wool, salt, stones, thread, 3 bags, Grandpa's herbal remedies. Eileen packed her own bag: bandages, ointments, decoctions, water, food for a week. He looked at her, said she didn't have to. She gave him that look that always made him fall silent. She said she had to. The 3 of them set out: Ian, Eileen, and Wren. It was a half-day's journey to Grey Ash. They settled into an empty house on the edge of the village. The first day, Ian stood by the well. He laid out his tools: nails arranged in a circle, woolen threads stretching from each nail toward the center. In the center lay a stone, a large, river-worn one, wrapped in a triple layer of wool and soaked in salt. He dropped to his knees, placed his hands on the stone, closed his eyes, and began to pull. The first layer came out with difficulty, thick, dense, with a taste of old blood. He pulled it through himself into the stone, slowly, thread by thread. His body resisted. His joints began to ache after 10 minutes, his head after 20. By the end of the hour, he could no longer feel his hands. He stopped. He opened his eyes. The stone had darkened. The nails were covered with a black film. The first layer was removed. 29 remained. He stood up. His legs buckled. Wren grabbed him by the elbow. She led him home. Eileen was waiting with water and a blanket. He lay down. He was shivering. His teeth were chattering. The taste of someone else's death lingered in his mouth. He closed his eyes and drifted off. The second day. The same thing. The second layer. Harder. Deeper. This layer didn't smell of blood but of earth. Heavy, wet earth. A layer in which lay the bones of those who had died from this curse years ago. He dug and felt them. Not faces, not names. Fear. Their fear. Soaked into the earth along with the bodies. He drew that fear through himself, and the stone turned black, and the nails turned black, and the wool crumbled, and he replaced the wool and the nails and continued. An hour and a half. He stopped when blood started flowing from his nose. Wren carried him into the house. Eileen wiped his face with a wet rag. He lay there, staring at the ceiling of a stranger's house. The cracks in the ceiling were different, not like the ones in his room above the shop. These were wider. The third day, the fourth, the fifth, one layer every day. Every evening he couldn't walk on his own. Every night he was shaking. Eileen sat beside him. She changed the rags on his forehead. She gave him water. She didn't leave. On the fifth night, he woke up in the dark. She was sitting on a chair next to his bed, asleep, her head tilted back, her hands on her knees. She hadn't left. He lay there and looked at her weather-beaten face, at her long arms, at her rolled-up sleeves. She sat by his side while he was sick, not because he asked her to, not because she had to, because she chose to. Something tightened in his throat, not a curse, not pain, something else. He turned his face toward the wall, clenched his teeth, and began to cry. Quietly, so she wouldn't hear. For the first time in his entire life, he wasn't crying from pain or grief. He was crying because someone had stayed. Just stayed by his side, without being asked, without feeling obligated, without a reason. Eileen heard him. She didn't let on. She sat with her eyes closed, breathing evenly, and waited for him to finish. Because she knew that some tears had to be cried like that. In the dark, in silence, with someone nearby who pretends to be asleep. The sixth day, the last layer, the deepest, the oldest. This layer was different. It didn't smell like iron or earth. It smelled like snow. Old snow. The kind that lies on the mountaintop and never melts. Ian pulled at it and felt something strange. This layer wasn't random. Someone had placed it there, long ago, deliberately, like a seal, like a lock. He pulled and the lock gave way, slowly, reluctantly. He pulled and images flashed through his mind. A woman, a crown, white hands, a voice that sings, and a second voice, a man's, quiet, accepting. Two voices woven into a single ritual. He tore away the last layer and fell, face down on the ground. Wren turned him over. Eileen pressed a rag to his nose. Blood was flowing from both nostrils. He lay on his back and looked up at the sky. Gray, low, beautiful. The stone in the center of the circle wasn't black. It was white, bleached, like bone. The nails crumbled into rusty dust. The wool had vanished. The water in the gray ash well was clear. On the seventh day, the village gathered at the house where he lay. Not a crowd, a line, a quiet one. Everyone brought something. Bread, dried fish, a jar of honey, woolen socks, a bundle of candles, a bunch of dried herbs, a small bag of salt. The child with the empty eyes brought a wooden horse. They didn't go inside. They didn't knock. They didn't wake him. They set their offerings on the porch and left, silently, one after another, like people who know that words aren't needed. When Ian woke up and stepped out onto the porch, he saw it all. The bread and honey and fish and socks and candles and the little wooden horse. He sat down on a step. He looked, for a long time. He couldn't get up. Eileen came out after him. She sat down beside him, silently. They sat on the porch and looked at the gifts. He thought that in his 23 years of life, people had given him things. For his birthday, for his engagement, out of obligation, out of custom. But no one had ever brought him bread from their own home simply because he'd helped. Without asking for anything in return. Without expecting anything. Just brought it and left. He sat on the step and couldn't get up. And Eileen sat beside him, silent. And that was enough. For 6 days, Ian had been pulling the mass curse out of the well in the village of Grey Ash, working through 1 layer a day at the limit of his strength. Eileen nursed him back to health every night. In the final layer, he sensed traces of an ancient ritual involving 2 voices. The villagers brought gifts to the porch of the house where he lay. It was the first time anyone had given him something without asking for anything in return. After Grey Ash, Ian couldn't work for 10 days. His body was paying the price. His joints were swollen. His fingers wouldn't bend. The cough returned. That same dry cough he'd been unable to shake for years, the one that came after every major job. Eileen didn't leave his side. She knew now. She knew it wasn't just fatigue. She knew that every curse he lifted left a residual mark on him, that his body was aging faster than it should, that the men of the Ravenlock family didn't live past 50. He hadn't told her this. She'd read it in the herbarium. There were notes from his grandfather, dry, precise, the dates of death for every Ravenlock over 6 generations. The oldest had lived to 52, the youngest had died at 31. She read those numbers while sitting at the table as he slept upstairs, and when he came downstairs in the morning, she said nothing. She poured tea, she set out bread, and her hands were steady, but her eyes weren't. Ian noticed. He didn't say anything. There are things that don't require words. On the 3rd day of his illness, Maya came by. She brought a drawing. The drawing was of Ian. He was lying in bed. Eileen was standing next to him with a mug. The sun was shining outside the window. Maya had drawn the sun bright yellow, even though it had been raining in Coldford for 3 weeks straight. She said she draws things as they, not as it is. Ian took the drawing. He hung it next to the first one. 2 drawings on the wall. 2 anchors. On the 5th day, Lyra Wenham arrived. Ian wasn't expecting her. He didn't know who she was. She walked into Eileen's shop the way people do who are used to other doors. Back straight, chin up, slender fingers on the cloak's clasp. A nice cloak, expensive fabric, but it was worn, old. She said she was Lyra Wenham, that she lived with Baron Redmond, as a companion, that she'd heard about the curse-caster in Coldford, that she'd come to take a look. Eileen stood behind the counter and looked at her with the kind of gaze country folk use when looking at city folk, without hostility, with a slight squint. Lyra didn't pay any attention. She looked at the shelves of herbs, at the notebooks on the table, at the map on the wall. She asked who did all this. Eileen said it was Ian. Lyra asked if she could see him. Eileen said he was sick. Lyra asked what was wrong with him. Eileen said it was his work. Lyra was silent for a moment. Then she said she'd wait. She sat down on a chair by the wall. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. She waited 4 hours. Eileen offered her some tea. She accepted. She drank in silence. She looked at the map, at the notebook, at the people who came into the shop. A soldier looking for burn ointment. An old woman looking for cough syrup. A young boy with a note from his mother. A typical day at the shop. Lyra watched. When Ian came downstairs in the evening, she stood up. He saw her and stopped on the stairs. Pale, thin, dark circles under his eyes. His hair was tousled. His shirt was wrinkled. He wasn't expecting visitors. She introduced herself. He nodded. He came downstairs. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him. She said she'd read about the Ravenlock house, that there were 3 references to it in the capital's library, all old, all disparaging, that the line of the cursed ones had died out, and thank heaven for that. She said this with that calm venom in her voice that people have who've seen how the capital's machinery of public opinion works. Ian asked why she was there. She paused. Then she told the truth, that she was bored, that she'd been exiled to the Mark for the sins of her family, that Baron Redmond was a kind old man, but deaf and half-blind, and that she spent her days playing the lute to the walls, that she'd heard about him and what he was doing, and that for the first time in 2 years, she'd heard something that made sense. Ian looked at her. A delicate face, intelligent eyes, a sharp mouth. She was the kind of person who hides pain behind wit. He recognized this type. There are many like her in the capital, but in the capital they hide in salons, and this one had come to the ends of the earth because she'd heard about the man with the rusty nails. He said he had records, lots of records, notebooks, his grandfather's herbarium, Wren's maps, Eileen's observations. Everything was scattered, everything in different handwritings. He needed someone to compile it all into a single book, a system, an order, so that the knowledge wouldn't depend on him alone, so that if he were gone tomorrow, someone could open this book and carry on. Lyra listened. He saw her eyes light up, not brightly, with a quiet, steady fire. The fire of a person hearing for the first time that she is needed not for entertainment, but for work that will endure. She said she could do it, that she knew how, that she had good handwriting and a logical mind, and that she had spent 2 years organizing Baron Redmond's library simply out of boredom. He nodded. He took 3 notebooks out of the chest. He placed them on the table. She opened the first one. She read. She flipped through the pages. She squinted at his handwriting, then at Eileen's handwriting, then at Wren's scribbles. She looked up. She said it was chaos. He said he knew. She said she needed a month. He said she had as much time as she needed. She took the notebooks. She left. Eileen stood at the counter and looked at the door through which Lyra had exited. She said she was from the capital. Ian said yes. Eileen said she was beautiful. Ian looked at her. She was looking at him, expressionless. He said he hadn't noticed. She snorted and went into the storeroom. Lyra returned 3 days later with questions, lots of questions, precise ones, specific ones. She had read all 3 notebooks and the herbalist's notes and found 12 places where the entries contradicted each other. She laid out the sheets with her notes on the table and asked questions. Does this number refer to that village or this one? Does grandfather's note here mean concentration or depth? Is this drawing by Wren a view from above or a view from the west? Ian answered. She took notes, quickly, neatly, in beautiful, even handwriting. By evening, she had a plan for the book. A structure, sections, cross-references between the herbarium and the maps. Ian looked at it and thought that in 6 generations of the Ravenlocks, no one had thought to organize their knowledge into a system. Everyone wrote their own notes. Everyone died, and the next one had to decipher someone else's scribbles. In 3 days, Lyra had done what his family hadn't done in 100 years. He told her that. She looked at him. For the first time since they'd met, her expression changed. Not a smile. Something softer. Something she'd been hiding behind her sharp words and straight back. She said it was just a matter of order. That order wasn't a gift. It was a habit. He said that habits that save knowledge from destruction are worth no less than gifts. She turned away, quickly, gathered the sheets of paper, said she'd come back tomorrow, left. Wren sat in the corner, sharpening knives. She looked up. She looked at Ian. She said he was gathering people like stones for a talisman, one by one, each for their own task, each in their own place. Ian said he wasn't gathering them, that they came on their own. Wren snorted. She said it was all the same. After Grey Ash, Ian spent 10 days recovering. Lyra Wenham arrived, a former capital aristocrat exiled to the Mark. Ian tasked her with organizing all his notes and his grandfather's herbalist records into a single book. In 3 days, Lyra had created a structure and an outline. There were now 4 people around Ian: Eileen, Wren, Lyra, and Maya. Toward the end of the 3rd month, Hannah Cho arrived in Coldford. She didn't knock on the gate. A guard found her in the morning. She was sitting by the wall, legs crossed, hands on her knees, eyes closed. She wore a gray habit, her hair in a tight braid, and 4 strands of black beads around her neck. She wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. The guard asked who she was. She opened her eyes, dark, eerily calm. She said she was a nun, that she was coming from the south, and that she was looking for a spring. The guard didn't understand what kind of spring. She didn't explain. She asked for water. He brought it. She drank. She stood up. She bowed. She entered the city. Ian heard about her from Wren. Wren said there was a woman in a habit standing at the gate who smelled of the road and looked at people as if she could see right through them. Ian went to the gate. He found Hannah in the market square. She was standing by the well, her palm over the water, without touching it. He stopped 10 paces away. He watched. She was doing the same thing he was, testing the water. Not with tools, not with herbs, with her palm. She was a curse caster. She lowered her hand, turned toward him. They stood facing each other, 10 paces. She looked at him and he saw her lips twitch. Not a smile, recognition. She said she could sense him, that she had sensed him for the past 2 days of their journey, that he was like a fire in the fog, that she had been walking toward that fire. He said he was Ian Ravenlock. She said she knew that the house of Ravenlock was mentioned in her convent's writings, that the bloodline came from the northern continent, that she'd thought the line had died out. He said it almost had. She nodded. They stood in the square, and between them stood a well, and the water in the well was clear because Ian had cleaned it out a month ago. She said that her convent was called the Silent Chalice, that it stood on the southern continent, that the nuns did the same thing as the Ravenlocks. They lifted curses. They absorbed them, processed them, restored the land to purity. That 2 years ago the convent had been burned down. She said this in an even voice, without a tremor, without a pause. The way people speak of things that have already burned out inside, leaving only ashes. Ian asked who. She said it was a cult, from Holgrave, that they called themselves the Singing Ashes, that they've been waiting 200 years, waiting for someone capable of undoing an ancient curse, that they burned down the monastery because the nuns knew how to seal the rifts, and the cult doesn't want the rifts sealed. The cult wants the rifts to open. Ian stood there and listened. The wind swept across the square. Cold, November wind. She said that on that day she had gone to fetch water, that when she returned, the convent was on fire, that she stood on the hill and watched, that she didn't cry, that her legs wouldn't move, that she stood there until dark. Then she set out. She walked for 2 years, following the cult's trail, across 2 continents, across seas, through countries he didn't know, and the trail led her here, to the northern mark, to Holgrave. She said the cult was here, that they knew about it, about Ian, that he is a beacon to them, that he carries within him something they can sense. Ian grew cold, not from the wind, from her words. He knew he carried a great deal within him, the remnants of hundreds of curses, the trace of the Holloway's ancestral curse, sediment accumulated over the years. But a beacon, that was new. That was terrifying. She said she didn't know exactly what was burning so brightly within him, but that the cult could sense it, and that they would come. Not now, but they would come. He asked what she wanted. She was silent for a long time. Then she said she wanted to close the rift, that she'd been taught how to do it, not entirely, piece by piece, theoretically, that the monastery held the knowledge but not the power, that power comes from the bloodline, from the vessel, from someone like him, that she could provide the knowledge, he could provide the power. Together they could do what neither of them could do alone. He stood there and looked at her. A nun with 4 strands of prayer beads, each strand for a year of service, calm to the point of being eerie, with pain burned out inside her, with knowledge worth an entire monastery. He said he needed to think it over. She nodded, said she'd wait, that she'd been waiting 2 years. She'd wait a little longer. He took her to Eileen. Eileen gave her a room. Hannah sat down on the bed. She closed her eyes. A minute later, she was asleep. Eileen stood in the doorway and watched her. Then she looked at Ian. She asked who she was. He said she was a cursed woman, a nun, the only survivor from the convent, that she'd come because of him. Eileen was silent for a moment. Then she said the room needed to be heated, that the woman was freezing, that her hands were blue, and she went to get some firewood. That evening, the 5 of them sat together. Ian, Eileen, Wren, Lyra, Hannah. The table in Eileen's shop was small. The 5 of them sat cramped around it, elbow to elbow. Hannah ate slowly, in silence, with the dignity of a hungry person who doesn't want to show that she's hungry. Eileen kept passing her bread, without asking. Wren sat in the corner and watched Hannah with the kind of gaze scouts use to assess strangers, direct and piercing. Lyra asked questions about the monastery, about the method, about the difference between the southern and northern schools of the craft of curses. Hannah answered slowly, thoughtfully, every word as precise as a nail driven into the right spot. Lyra took notes. Ian sat and watched them, the 5 of them at one table. A month ago, he'd sat here alone, with a mug of cold tea, with a notebook, with a crack in the ceiling. And now the table was small because there were so many people. He hadn't gathered them. Wren was right and wrong. He hadn't gathered them, they had come. Each for their own reason, each with their own pain. Eileen with her dead brother, Wren with the emptiness the clan had hammered into her head, Lyra with her exile and her sense of uselessness, Hannah with the ashes of the monastery, and he himself, with a white streak on his finger where the ring used to be, with a cough, with curses in his blood, with 14 years of silence. They sat at the cramped table, eating bread and drinking tea, and Lyra said something sharp about Baron Redmond, and Wren laughed out loud for the first time in her life. A short, sharp laugh, like a fox's bark. Everyone looked at her. She fell silent. She blushed. She turned away. Eileen was smiling. Hannah looked at Wren, and there was something warm in her calm eyes. Ian sat there, holding his mug with both hands, and thought, "This is it. This is it. This is what he left the capital for. Not a heroic deed, not glory, not revenge. A table, bread, laughter, people nearby." Then Hannah said she had something else to tell them, that the cult of the Singing Ashes didn't just want to open the rift, they wanted to unleash an ancient curse, the very one the Queen of Veilguard had cast 200 years ago. They wanted to end the war that had begun back then, and to do that, they needed the judge. Ravenlock. Alive. Strong. Capable of containing the curse of an entire army and directing it wherever they command. The table fell silent. Eileen set down her mug. Wren placed her hand on her knife, automatically, without thinking. Lyra stopped writing. Mai wasn't at the table. She was sleeping at Holt's. And it was a good thing she wasn't. Hannah looked at Ian, steadily, calmly. She said they would come for him, without asking, without offering. They would come and take him. He sat there in silence, thinking about the lighthouse, about what was burning in his chest. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he knew Hannah was right, that they would come, and that he had to be ready for it. Hannah Cho had arrived in Coldford, a curse-casting nun from the southern continent, the sole survivor of the convent burned down by the cult of the Singing Ashes. She explained that the cult was operating out of Holgrave and that Ian was a beacon to them. The cult wants to use him as a vessel to unleash the Queen's ancient curse. Ian is now surrounded by 5 people and a common threat. In the 4th month, the Order of the Bright Blade arrived in Coldford. 12 horsemen, white cloaks, silver clasps. Their horses were well fed and clean. They rode through the gates at dawn, and the entire garrison came out to watch. Leading the way was Sir Alden Markroft, commander of the Order. Tall, upright, a smooth face, a gentle smile, attentive eyes. He dismounted at the barracks and, first of all, bowed to Captain Holt, properly, respectfully, as one bows to an equal. Holt stood with a stony face. Markroft said he had arrived on behalf of the Chancellery, that rumors had reached the capital about the cursed man on the border, that the Order wished to offer patronage, protection, a title, gold, a place at court. He spoke in an even, pleasant voice, the way people do when they're used to having their words received with gratitude. Holt said the Cursed One was here, that he was a free man, that it was up to him to decide. Markroft smiled. "Of course," he said. He said he was here not to command, but to make an offer. Ian stood on the 2nd floor of Eileen's shop and looked out the window at the white cloaks. Wren stood beside him. She said there were 12 of them, that they were well armed, that the horses were war horses, not travel horses. Ian nodded. He could see that. This wasn't a delegation, it was a detachment. Mycroft came over with a smile and his swords. He went downstairs. He stepped out onto the street. He approached Mycroft. They stood facing each other. The commander of the order in a white cloak trimmed with silver, and a pale, thin man in a rumpled shirt with dark circles under his eyes. Mycroft held out his hand. Ian shook it. The commander's hand was dry and strong. Mycroft said he'd heard all about it, about the captain's daughter, about the villages, about Grey Ash, that it was impressive. Ian remained silent. Mycroft said that people like Ian needed to be protected, that his gift was too valuable to be wasted in the backwoods, that in the capital there were laboratories and archives and experts who could help him develop his abilities, that the crown was ready to recognize the House of Ravenlock officially with lands and a title, that all that was needed was consent. Ian listened. Every word was right. Every sentence made sense. Gold, a title, recognition, everything a fading house could dream of. His grandfather had dreamed of this. His father had given up on dreaming and shut himself away in 3 rooms until his death. And now it lay before Ian, right in the palm of his hand. He looked at Mycroft, at his gentle smile, at his attentive eyes, and he saw what Mycroft hadn't said. The capital doesn't want to help him. The capital wants to control him. A man who knows how to lift curses from the land is a political asset. A man who does this for free and yet does not submit to the crown is a political problem. Mycroft is no villain. He sincerely believes that taking Ian under the order's wing is a blessing. For everyone. For the crown. For the order. For Ian himself. In his view, that's how the world works. There is the crown. There is order. There are people with gifts. People with gifts serve the crown. The crown protects people with gifts. Everyone is happy. Simple. Beautiful. And it completely overlooks one thing, that Ian doesn't want to be anyone's tool. Not anymore. He said no. One word. Quiet. Steady. Mycroft didn't flinch. The smile remained. He asked if he could know the reason. Ian said his work was here, that the mark needed him, that he couldn't leave. Mycroft said the order could send people, that they would help Mark, that Ian shouldn't have to carry this burden alone. Ian looked at him. He said the order had sent people, 23 over the past 10 years. They'd all left. Mycroft was silent, the first crack in his gentle smile. Fleeting, almost imperceptible. He regained his composure in a second. He said he understood, that he respected that he wouldn't press the matter, but that the offer remained open and that the chancellery would await a response. He bowed. He walked back to his people. Ian stood in the street and knew this wasn't the end. Mycroft would leave. He'll write a report. The chancellery will read it, and in a month or 2, something else will come. Not an invitation, a demand. That evening, Holt came to see him. He sat down at the table. He poured drinks for both of them. He said the garrison was behind Ian, that if the order tried to take him by force, Coldford would stand its ground. Ian looked at the captain, the man who had held the fort for 10 years without help, who had buried his wife and his sergeant and hadn't broken, who had written reports into the void and kept going. This man had just said he was ready to stand against the order of the crown for a pale, cursed man he'd known for 4 months. Ian said thank you. Just thank you. And this time, his voice didn't waver. Mycroft left 2 days later, with a smile, with bows, with a promise that the order was always happy to help. The white cloaks disappeared behind the southern hill. Wren stood on the wall and watched them go. She came down. She walked over to Ian. She said they would return. He said he knew. She said, next time, no smiles. He said he knew. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said he'd stood his ground well, that he hadn't buckled, that it was... She didn't finish. She turned away. She left. He stood by the gate and thought he'd just taken his first truly adult step. Not lifting a curse, not healing a child, not cleaning out a well, saying no to a man who offered everything his family had waited for over generations. To say no and stay, here, where he was needed, where he had chosen to be. The Order of the Bright Blade, led by Commander Alden Marcroft, arrived in Coldford with an offer of protection and a place at court. Ian refused. The garrison stood behind him. Marcroft left, his threats disguised as politeness. Holt confirmed that Coldford would defend Ian. Wren warned that the order would return. In the 5th month, Seryn arrived, without an entourage, without servants, in a traveling cloak, on a horse that could barely stand from exhaustion. The guard at the gate recognized the Holloway crest on the saddlebag and sent for the captain. Holt sent for Ian. Ian was standing in the shop reading Lyra's notes when a soldier entered and said there was a woman at the gate, that she was asking for him, that there was a songbird on her bag. Ian set the notebook on the table, slowly, carefully, closed it, placed his hands on the cover, sat like that for 10 seconds. Eileen stood behind the counter and said nothing. He stood up, went out, walked down Coldford Street toward the gate. A familiar street, familiar cobblestones, the familiar smell of smoke and wet wood. He walked and thought about the white streak on his finger. It had been gone for a long time. His finger had tanned. It had evened out. The streak had vanished as if it had never been there for 7 years. She was standing by the gate. He saw her and stopped 20 paces away. Seryn Holloway. Tall, blonde, beautiful. But not the way he remembered her. She'd lost weight, dark circles under her eyes, dark, deep. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, not like she usually wore it. Usually every strand was in place. Not now. She saw him and froze. He walked toward her, and with every step he felt it. Her curse, an ancestral one, a heavy one, that very one. It had returned. He'd been pulling it out of her for 9 years, and it had lain quietly within him, slumbering. But now that he wasn't by her side, it had returned to her. Migraines, nightmares, insomnia, a voice on the verge of breaking. He could see it in her face, in the way she stood, in the way she held her hands, her fingers clenched, white. He stepped closer. He stopped 3 steps away. She looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. Not the kind of fear caused by a curse, a different kind. The fear of someone who realized what they'd done and had come to stand before the person they'd hurt. She said she hadn't come to bring him back. She said she had no right. She said she'd come to ask for forgiveness and to leave. He stood there and listened. She spoke softly, not in that even voice she'd used in the Holloway's living room in front of witnesses. A different one, a cracked one. She said her migraines had returned 3 weeks after he left, that the nightmares came a month later, that her voice started to crack on high notes, that she went to a healer. The healer said it was nerves. She went to another one. He said it was exhaustion. She went to a third. The third looked at her for a long time and asked if there was a curse caster near her. She didn't understand. He explained, and then she understood. Everything, all at once. 14 years, since he was 14. He silently drew the curse out of her. Every evening after visiting her, every night, for years. And she never once asked why he was pale. Never once asked why he had a cough. Never once asked why, after every meeting, he would leave and lie alone in the empty Ravenlock house, unable to get up. She said that when she realized it, she couldn't breathe. That she sat on the floor of her room in the Holloway house and couldn't breathe. 3 hours, on the floor. She said that Cameron had left for the north a month ago and hadn't written once. That it didn't matter. That Cameron didn't matter. That what mattered was what she had done to the man who had borne her pain for 14 years and whom she had called a shadow. Ian stood there and listened. The wind blew through the gate. Cold, November wind. He listened, and inside him there was no anger, nor was there joy, nor was there triumph. There was something quiet, like the last note that fades away slowly in an empty room. He told her the truth. For the first time in all those years. He told her about the 14 years, about how he'd begun to bear her curse because he loved her and because he could, about how he'd grown accustomed to it, about how her lineage casts a heavy curse that smells of wet iron, about how after every visit he'd lie down and couldn't get up, about the cough, about his joints, about how the men of the Ravenlocks don't live long, and how every year with her curse in his chest shortened his life. Seryn listened. Tears streamed down her face, quietly, soundlessly. She didn't wipe them away. He said he felt hurt, not because she'd left him for Cameron, but because she'd never once asked. Because she'd looked at him every day for 7 years and hadn't seen him, hadn't wanted to see him. Because to see him would mean admitting that he wasn't a shadow, that he was alive, that he was in pain. And that didn't fit into a world where the strong are those who swing swords and the weak are those who cough. She stood there listening and crying, and he didn't comfort her. He didn't come over. He didn't take her hand. He stood 3 steps away. For the first time in his life, he was telling her the truth, and the truth stood between them like a wall. She said she would leave, that she wouldn't ask for anything, that she just wanted him to know that she understood, that it was too late, but she understood. He nodded. She turned toward her horse. He watched her back. She walked, her shoulders trembling, and he could see how hard it was for her to walk. Not out of weakness, out of shame. He could have let her go, could have let her leave, could have closed that door forever. But he thought about what he'd learned at Grey Ash, about the final layer, about the 2 voices in the ancient ritual, about the queen and her 2 hands. The Ravenlocks provided the vessel, the Holloways provided the voice. He told her to stop. She stopped. She didn't turn around. He said he didn't forgive her. Not yet, anyway. But if she wants to do something real, then let her stay. Not as a bride, not as a guest. As a student. He'll teach her the craft of discernment. Teach her to hear the curse. Teach her to use the voice that every Holloway possesses, but that no one has used in 200 years. She turned around, looked at him. Red eyes, a wet face. She said yes. 1 word, quietly. He nodded, turned around, walked over to the bench, didn't look back. Eileen stood by the window. She saw everything. When he came in, she set a cup of tea in front of him. Hot. He sat down. His hands were shaking. Not from the curse, from the fact that he had just done the hardest thing. He hadn't forgiven her, nor had he refused her. He'd given her a chance, one she could earn, or not. Winter settled over the town in a single night. Snow, white, heavy. Coldford's rooftops sagged beneath it. Smoke rose straight up from the chimneys. The air was still. The cold seeped to the bone. Ian worked, every day. Lyra finished the first volume of the book. 32 sections. Maps, tables, cross-references, identification methods, purification methods, recipes for talismans. She brought the manuscript and placed it on the table in front of Ian. He opened it. He leafed through it. He read. His grandfather had scribbled notes in the margins. His father hadn't written anything. And now everything 6 generations of the Ravenlocks had known lay on the table in neat lines of Lyra Wenham's beautiful handwriting. He closed the book. He placed his hand on the cover. He said it was more important than anything he'd ever done on the mark. Lyra stood across from him. Her back was straight, her mouth was sharp, but her eyes were soft. She said it wasn't her, that it was him, that she'd simply put it in order. He shook his head. He said that knowledge without order is ashes, and order without knowledge is an empty shelf, and that she had made a book out of ashes. She turned away, quickly, but he had seen it. For the first time in all the time they'd known each other, an expression appeared on Lyra Wenham's face that couldn't be hidden behind wit. Hannah worked with Ian every evening. They sat in the room above the shop, and she told him stories about the monastery's methods, about how the southern nuns sealed small fissures, about the rituals, about the singing, about how a curse is not an enemy but a wound, and that a wound is not cut with a sword but sewn shut. Ian listened and took notes, and he understood that the monastery's method and the Ravenlock's method were two halves of the same craft. The Ravenlocks absorb, the nuns guide. The Ravenlocks are the vessel, the nuns are the channel. Together, they can do more than just lift curses from people and wells. They can seal the rifts, heal the land, not the symptoms, but the cause. He told this to Hannah. She nodded. She said her teacher had said the same thing, that long ago the vessels and the nuns had worked together, that later the world had divided them, north and south, blood and vows, and each half grew weaker without the other. Seryn studied, hard, in silence. She lived in an empty house on the outskirts of town. She'd come to Eileen in the morning. She worked all day. Eileen taught her about herbs. Ian taught her to sense curses. Hannah taught her how to breathe. Seryn didn't complain. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for leniency. She got up before everyone else and left later. Her hands were red from the cold water and the herbs. She, who had never washed dishes in her life. Ian watched. He didn't approach her. He didn't help more than necessary. But he saw. He saw how she was changing. How that neat beauty, which had been merely a shell, was slipping away from her. How something else was emerging. Something real. Something raw. Something alive. One evening she was singing, quietly, in the empty house, unaware that he was passing by. An old song, the Holloway's Lullaby. And he stopped on the street and listened, and he felt the air tremble from her voice, not metaphorically, literally. The Holloway's voice carried power, the very same power with which the Queen had sung her curse 200 years ago. The voice and the vessel, two instruments of a single ritual. He stood in the snow, listening and thinking that the rift could be sealed, not theoretically, practically, if he provided the vessel, if Seryn provided the voice, if Hannah provided the direction, if Wren provided the map, if Lyra recorded every step so that the knowledge would not die, if Eileen would hold him when he began to fall, if Holt and the garrison would hold the perimeter. Meanwhile, Lyra was sorting through her grandfather's last papers, old, fragile, in the very bottom layer of the chest, and she found it. A letter, 200 years old, on yellowed paper. The handwriting was small, old. She read it all evening. Then she went to Ian. She placed it on the table. She said he needed to read it. He read it. The letter was from the first Ravenlock, the one who stood beside the Queen on the day of the catastrophe. He was writing to his son. He was writing the truth, that the House of Ravenlock and the House of Way were not victims. They were the Queen's instruments. The Ravenlocks provided the vessel for the curse. The Holloways provided the voice for the ritual. They knew what they were doing. They helped her curse the enemy army. And when the curse broke free control and sank into the earth, the two houses parted ways. The Ravenlocks took the blame upon themselves. They agreed to fade away. They agreed to become those who are not remembered. The Holloways forgot. Deliberately. They erased from their history everything that linked them to the disaster. And they lived for 200 years as a pure, noble house. But the Ravenlocks died, generation after generation, carrying in their blood the mark of what they had helped create. Ian finished reading. He set the letter on the table. He sat in silence. Lyra sat across from him and said nothing. He understood now. Why he'd been so drawn to Seryn since childhood. Why her curse was so heavy. Why it felt as familiar to him as his own. Because it was his own. Two houses bound by blood and guilt. Two instruments of a single crime. He stood up, went out into the street. Snow was falling, quiet, soft. He stood in the snow and thought about what his grandfather had known, and remained silent. And his father had known, and remained silent. And for 14 years he had been carrying the curse from Seryn, unaware that he was carrying a part of his own family's guilt. He stood there and thought about the rift, about Holgrave, about how a curse, one his ancestor had helped create, had been seeping through this land for 200 years, and that perhaps his duty was not simply to heal the mark, village by village. Perhaps his duty was to close what his family had helped open. He returned to the house. He gathered everyone: Eileen, Wren, Lyra, Hannah. Seryn was the last to arrive. He told them everything. About the letter, about the 2 houses, about the queen, about the guilt. A heavy silence hung over the table. Seryn sat as white as snow by the window. She didn't know. Her family had forgotten. They'd erased it, hidden it. And now the truth lay on the table like an old letter on yellowed paper. Ian said he wanted to go to the rift, that he wanted to try to close it, that it wasn't a feat or atonement, that it was work. The same work as with the well in Grey Ash, only bigger, much bigger. Hannah said she'd go with him. Wren said she'd show the way. Lyra said she'd record every step. Eileen said she'd be there. Seryn sat in silence. Then she raised her head. She said that her voice was needed for the ritual, that she understood, that the 2 houses had created this together, and the 2 houses must close it together. Ian looked at her. For the first time in 5 months, he didn't look at her as his ex-fiancée or as a student. He looked at her as a person who had made a choice. He nodded. Winter on the Mark. Lyra finished the Ravenlock's Book of Knowledge and found a letter among her grandfather's old papers that revealed the secret. 200 years ago, the Ravenlock and Holloway houses had been the Queen's accomplices in creating the curse. Ian told everyone the truth. The team decided to go to the Holgrave Fault to close what their ancestors had helped to open. They set out at the beginning of the 6th month. 6 people: Ian, Wren, Hannah, Eileen, Lyra, Seryn. Holt stayed behind in Coldford. Someone had to man the garrison. Before they left, he approached Ian. He stood facing him, tall, stony, with a face that couldn't reveal what was inside. He said one thing. He told Ian to come back, that Maya was waiting. Ian nodded. Maya was standing next to her father. She wasn't crying. She was holding a pebble in her hand. That very one. Smooth. From the river. The one he'd given her during their first week together. She held it out to Ian. She said it was for good luck, that he should return it when he came back. He took the pebble, put it in his pocket. Heavy, small, warm from her palm. They walked out through the gate and headed northeast, toward Holgrave. Wren led the way. She knew the route. 3 days through the marsh, through the snow, through villages that grew poorer and quieter, through forests where the trees stood black and bare, through fields where the grass was dead, even beneath the snow. Ian could feel the corruption growing, with every step northward, with every passing hour. The rumbling in the earth grew louder, heavier. By the end of the 2nd day, his gums were bleeding. On the 3rd day, they saw the rift. Not a pit, not a crack. A place where the earth had ceased to be earth. A plain, flat, gray, without snow. Snow didn't settle on it. It melted in the air before it could reach the ground. The earth was warm, not from fire, but from the corruption. The grass at the edge of the plain grew black and stiff as wire. The trees around it stood without bark, white, bare, like bones. In the center of the plain, the earth was cracked. Steam rose from the cracks. Not hot, cold. The steam smelled of wet iron and something sweet. That very same scent Ian had sensed from his very first day on the mark. the scent of an ancient curse. He stood at the edge and watched, and he felt something inside him respond. A shard of the Holloway's curse, the remnants of hundreds of curses he had lifted over these past months. It all hummed in his chest, resonating to the rift. The beacon. Hannah was right. He was the beacon. Hannah stood beside him, silently. She looked at the rift. Then she said it could be sealed, that she knew how, but that it would require everything he had to give, and perhaps more. He asked how much more. She didn't answer. He understood. They set up camp at the edge of the plain. The campfire burned strangely. The flames veered away from the fissure as if from the wind, but there was no wind. Ian didn't sleep that night. He lay there and felt the earth rumbling beneath him, like a pulse, slow, heavy. Eileen slept beside him. Wren was on watch. Lyra wrote by candlelight. Hannah was meditating. Seryn sat by the fire and stared into the flames. In the morning, the cult arrived, the singing ashes. They didn't attack. They emerged from the fog, 12 figures in black robes, hoods, masks, not a single face. The leader stepped forward, tall, thin. His voice was hoarse. He said he had been waiting, that he had been leading Ravenlock here for 2 years, that the corruption on the mark, which had intensified over the past few months, was no accident. They had been pushing it along, opening small sources, awakening the dormant corruption, so that Ravenlock would come here, to the rift, to the center, because only here can the curse be unleashed, only with a living vessel. Ian stood and listened, and he understood. The dead foxes Wren had found, the new sources of corruption. The well in Grey Ash that had been infected for 30 years but had burst open right now. It wasn't a coincidence. The cult was guiding him, pushing him, led him like cattle to a watering hole. He looked at the leader. The leader held out his hand, said that Ian could finish what his ancestors had started. Unleash the curse, direct it at Holgrave's enemies. End the war that had lasted 200 years. Become what the Ravenlocks were meant to be, not as quiet vessels, as weapons. Ian stood in the gray morning light and looked at the outstretched hand. He could have. He felt the power of the rift, felt the curse inside him reaching out to it, like 2 magnets. He could have taken that power and channeled it. He could have become a weapon. He could have ended the war. He could have become the one they remember. He said no. The leader wasn't surprised. He nodded. He raised his hand. 12 figures stepped forward. Wren drew her knives. Hannah stood beside Ian. Eileen retreated behind the rocks. Lyra clutched the manuscript to her chest. Seryn stood there, her hands trembling, but she didn't back down. The garrison soldiers Holt had sent after them emerged from behind the hill. 10 men, with swords. Holt couldn't let them go alone. He's a soldier. He knows the enemy comes when you least expect it. The fight was brief. The cultists weren't warriors. They were fanatics. Strong in corruption, but weak in body. Wren killed 3 in the first few seconds. The soldiers took down 5 more. The rest fled. The leader was the last to remain. He stood and looked at Ian across the field. Then he removed his mask. An old face. Wrinkles. Gray eyes without pupils. He himself had been poisoned by the curse. He said the rift couldn't be sealed, that the earth was sick forever, that Ian would die in vain. Ian looked at him, at the old poisoned face, at the gray eyes, at the man who had waited 200 years believing that the only answer to a curse was another curse. He said that a curse was not the answer. A curse is a wound, and wounds are healed. The leader laughed, a hoarse, dry laugh. He turned around. He walked off into the fog. Wren wanted to catch up. Ian said not to. Let him go. They stood by the rift, 6 people and 10 soldiers. No snow was falling. The earth hummed. Ahead lay a plain from which pain had been seeping for 200 years. Ian stood in the center of the plain. The ground beneath his feet was warm and rumbling. The rumble came from deep within. Steady, heavy, like the heartbeat of something enormous and sick. He took off his cloak, folded it neatly, placed it on a rock. He took off his gloves. His palms were white from the cold. His fingers were slender, long. The working hands of Ravenlock. He looked at them, the hands with which he had drawn out the curse from children and the elderly and from wells, the hands that had borne another's curse for 9 years without asking for anything in return, the hands with which he had removed the ring in the Holloway's living room and placed it on the table. He clenched and unclenched his fists. He turned around. They were standing in a circle, just as they'd agreed, just as Hannah had explained, just as Ian had positioned each of them, the way he made amulets, for a specific person, for a specific place. Ren and the soldiers in the outer circle, swords at the ready, knives at their belts. Ren stood with that calm expression she sometimes had before a fight, not angry, not tense, empty, clear, ready. Behind her were 10 soldiers, garrison troops, the very ones Holt had sent after them. Hannah was in the second ring, on her knees, palms on the ground, her fingers splayed, pressed into the stone and the frozen soil, her eyes closed. She had begun even before he knelt, preparing a channel, a passage deep within through which the corruption would flow back. Without a channel, it would have spread across the surface. With a channel, it would go down, back to where it came from. Hannah was the channel. She was what they taught at the monastery of the Silent Chalice. To guide, not to take, not to cut, to guide. Lyra on the third ring, not on her knees, on the stone, flat, wide. She spread out the manuscript, opened a blank page, quill in her right hand, inkwell pressed against her left. She wrote. Every step, every action, every detail she could see, because that was her role, not to hold, not to sing, not to lead, to record, so that knowledge would not die. So that if tomorrow there were no Ian, no Hannah, and no one left who remembered, someone could open this book and read it, and try again. Lyra wrote, and her hands did not tremble. She was a chronicler, and that was no less important than wielding a sword, perhaps more important. Swords break, books remain. Eileen stood behind him, close, half a step away, her hands on his shoulders. He could feel her palms through the fabric of his shirt, warm, broad, rough from herbs and work. Hands that ground roots in a mortar every morning, that bandaged him after gray ash, that made him tea without asking, that held a wet cloth to his forehead when he thrashed about in a fever. She would hold him, physically, when his body gave out, when his legs could no longer support him, when his consciousness begins to drift away, she will hold him. She knew this would happen. She knew, and she stood there. Seryn stood in the circle, between Hannah and Ian, upright, pale, her eyes red from sleeplessness, or from tears, or from both. Her hands folded in front of her, fingers intertwined. She was preparing to sing. The voice of the Holloways, that very instrument which, 200 years ago, created this curse together with the Ravenlock's vessel. 2 houses, 2 hands, 2 instruments of a single ritual. 200 years ago, they opened the wound. Today, they would close it. Ian looked at each of them, at Ren with her knives, at Hannah with her silence, at Lyra with her quill, at Eileen behind him, at Seryn in front of him. 6 people. None of them were supposed to be here. Ren could have gone back to the clan. Hannah could have died on the road. Lyra could have spent her life as a companion to a deaf baron. Eileen could have remained an herbalist in the shop. Seryn could have stayed as Cameron's wife in the capital. They had chosen to be here. All of them. Every single one. With their own 2 eyes. Ian dropped to his knees, slowly. His knees touched the warm earth. He placed his palms on the stone, spread his fingers. He pressed into the surface. He closed his eyes. The curse struck immediately. Not gently, not gradually. It struck like boiling water splashed onto bare hands. He clenched his teeth. The pain traveled from his fingers, up his wrists, along his forearms to his elbows, up to his shoulders, to his chest. He didn't pull his hands away. He felt the rift. All of it. Entirely. Vast. Like a bottomless well plunging hundreds of cubits into the depths. The corruption flowed from it, in a torrent, like a river. 200 years, without stopping, without respite. It rose from the depths and spread across the land, poisoning everything in its path. Water, earth, grass, trees, livestock, people, children. 200 years, and he had to turn that flow around. Not into himself, not as the Ravenlocks had done for hundreds of years. Into the ground. Back. Down. To seal the wound. To close it. He began to draw it out. The first layer. Fresh. Thin. Like a film on the surface of still water. He let it pass through him. Through his hands. Through his chest. Through his spine. And sent it downward. Through his palms. Through the stone. Back into the depths. His body shuddered. His back tensed. The muscles in his arms cramped. He continued. The second layer. Thicker. Heavier. With a taste of iron on his tongue. Third. Fourth. Fifth. Each layer passed through him like a knife through butter. Only the butter was his body. Kana was guiding him. He could feel her through the earth. Through the stone. 20 paces away. Her palms on the surface carved out a channel. An invisible channel deep within the earth through which the contamination flowed back. Without this channel, it would have spilled out. It would have spread to the sides. It would have poisoned new areas. With the channel, it flowed smoothly, downward, precisely, like water through a pipe. Hana did this in silence, without words, without gestures. She simply guided it, just as she'd been taught in the monastery that no longer exists. Seryn began to sing, quietly, almost in a whisper, an old melody, not a lullaby, another one, an ancient one, the one the Holloways sang 200 years ago, the one the Queen used to sing her curse. There were no words, only sound, only a voice, pure, high-pitched, trembling in the cold air. Ian felt the voice enter the ritual, how a note settled on the curse, how the curse responded. It remembered this voice, recognized it, like a dog recognizes its master's voice after years of separation. The voice that created it, the voice that called it from the depths 200 years ago. And now that voice was calling him back, home, into the depths, into the darkness, into peace. The 10th layer. His hands were burning. The fingers on his left hand could no longer feel the stone. He continued. The 20th. Blood began to flow from his nose, a thin trickle running down his upper lip. He swallowed. A salty taste on his tongue. He kept going. The 30th. Eileen gripped his shoulders, tighter. He could feel her grip through the pain, through the fire in his hands, through the buzzing in his head. She held him just as she'd promised, just as she always did. Silently, steadily, without panic. She could feel his body giving out, how the muscles in his back trembled beneath her hands, how he swayed. She kept him upright, on his knees, with his hands on the stone, because if he fell, the connection would be broken, and everything he'd drawn out over these past minutes would surge back, in a single blow, and kill him. The 40th layer. The 50th. He'd stopped counting. The curse was flowing through him like a river. He was a needle's eye. A single person through whom the 200-year-old pain of an entire land was passing. He felt everything, not abstractly, concretely. Every death, every fear. A child with gray eyes who never saw his mother. A woman who coughed up blood by the well and didn't live to see spring. A man who buried 3 sons, went into the forest and never returned. A cow that lay down and never... A tree that turned black and fell. A well that poisoned an entire village. All of this flowed through him, through his hands, through his chest, through his spine. Every thread of someone else's pain stretched through a living person and flowed back into the earth. His temples turned white. He felt his hair changing color. He didn't see it. He felt it, as if something were leaving his body. Not blood, not strength. Time. The years of life he was giving up for each layer. His grandfather had lived to 52, his father to 43. How much would be left for him? He didn't think about that. He thought about the pebble in his pocket, about Maya, who had given him a smooth river stone and said it was for good luck, about the promise he'd made to return it. Seryn sang. Her voice had changed, no longer cracked, no longer trembling. Clear, strong, full. The voice of her lineage. The voice that had slept within her for 23 years and had awakened here. Now, on this plain, at this fault line. She sang, and tears streamed down her face, but her voice did not falter. For the first time in her life, she sang neither for herself nor for an audience. She sang for the earth, for the wound her clan had helped inflict. And the earth heard her. Kana guided her. Lyra wrote. Wren stood with her knives, holding the perimeter. Creatures began to crawl out of the cracks in the ground. Small, black, shapeless. The last spawn of the fault line. The earth was spewing them out in agony, like a body expels pus from a wound when the wound is being cleaned. Wren slashed, quickly, precisely, without wasted movements, 2 knives in her hands. Step, strike, step, strike. The soldiers slashed with their swords. There were many creatures. They kept coming and coming. Small, weak, but endless. Holt had ended up here. He couldn't stay in Coldford. He couldn't. He arrived right behind them, with 5 soldiers. He appeared at the edge of the plain just as the creatures surged out of the cracks. Silently, he took his place in the line. He raised his sword, and he slashed. The captain, who had held the line for 10 years without help, stood on the outer ring and defended the man who, in half a year, had done more for his land than all the heroes sent over the past 10 years. Maya was sitting far away, beyond the hills, with 2 soldiers. She held a pebble in her fist, the one Ian had given her. No, another one. Her own, the one she'd found on the bank of a stream and which Ian had taught her to examine. She held it and didn't cry. She waited. Ian had sunk deeper, the final layers, the oldest, the heaviest, 200 years old. Here the corruption was different. Not dirty, not murky, pure, crystal clear, like ice, like a diamond. The curse in its primordial form. That's how it was created 200 years ago. The voice and the vessel, Holloway and Ravenlock, the queen and her 2 hands. He found the core. It lay deep within, not like a stone, like light, cold, white, with the scent of negativity. That snow that lies on the mountaintop and never melts. The core of the curse, the beginning, the source, the heart of the wound. He grasped it, with his palms through the earth, through the stone, through hundreds of cubits of rock. He felt the core just as he had felt Seryn's curse on that first day when he began to draw it out at the age of 14. Familiar, native. His blood knew this curse. His lineage had created this vessel. He pulled. His body gave out. His left arm went numb from the shoulder to the fingertips. Dead, like someone else's. His right hand held on. He pulled with one hand. Blood flowed from both nostrils, from his right ear, from his mouth. His eyes filled with red. The world turned crimson and blurry. Eileen held him. Her hands on his shoulders were the only thing he felt besides the pain. She was whispering, Not words, not a prayer, just a voice. His name. Ian, Ian, Ian. Over and over, quietly, steadily, like a metronome, like an anchor. She was calling him back, not letting him go there, into the depths, into the darkness, into the curse. He clung to her voice, to his name, to the way she pronounced it, not like Seryn used to pronounce it, not like his mother did when he was a child, like Eileen, simply, without embellishment, without strain, like calling someone to the table, to tea, to life. He pulled. The core gave way, slowly, reluctantly, like a root from the earth, like a tooth from the gums. It clung to the depths, to 200 years of habit, to stone, to rock, to the cliff. It didn't want to leave. It had become part of the earth. Seryn sang the final note, long, pure, high. The note vibrated in the air, in the earth, in the bones, in the blood. The note penetrated to the core, and the curse shuddered. It recognized the voice. It recognized the vessel. It recognized those who had created it. For 200 years it had waited. For 200 years it had lain in the depths, seeping outward, and waited. Not for an enemy, not for a hero, for those who had created it, so that they would come and take it away, set it free, carry it back. Ian wasn't directing the core toward himself. He was directing it downward, deeper, back to where it had been taken from. Not into the vessel, into the earth. Back. Home. The core let go. It left, slowly, like a stone sinking into dark water. Deeper, quieter, further, until it vanished. The earth sighed. Not a metaphor. He felt it, like a chest expanding after a long contraction. The earth relaxed. It let go. The rumbling ceased. For the first time in 200 years, the ground beneath Holgrave stopped vibrating. Silence fell over the plain like a blanket. True silence. Deep. Pure. Without the taste of iron. Without the smell of rot. Without the rumbling in the bones. The silence of healthy earth. The creatures stopped crawling out of the cracks. The last ones died on their own, turned black, crumbled, turned to dust. Wren stood with the knives in her hands and watched as the black dust settled on the snow. She sheathed the knives, slowly, each in its sheath. Left, right. Done. Ian opened his eyes. The world was crimson. Then it turned pink. Then it was normal. He looked at his hands. Black. Scorched. The skin on his palms was cracked. Blood had caked in the cracks. But he still had his hands, and they were his. He wiggled the fingers of his right hand. They obeyed. His left hand hung limply. He tried to move it. Nothing. He tried again. His little finger twitched. Then his ring finger. Then the rest. Slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, his left hand was coming back to him. He looked up. The sky was gray. Low. His sky. The sky on the stamp. And snow. Snow was falling on the plain. White. Soft. Real. It settled on the ground and didn't melt. For the first time in 200 years. The plain, which had been warm from the corruption, had cooled. It had become normal. It had become simply earth. And the snow settled on it just as it settles on any earth in November. Evenly, calmly, quietly. Ian didn't rise heroically. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't shout. He sat down. He simply sat down on the ground. His legs wouldn't hold him up. His arms wouldn't obey him. His back ached as if a wagon had run over it. He sat on the frozen ground, and the snow fell on his shoulders, his head, and his arms, on his white temples. He ran his right hand through his hair. He felt it, coarse, stiff, different. He couldn't see himself, but he knew. Gray hair, at 23. The price. Every Ravenlock pays it, with their body, with years, with their life. He had paid it. Eileen knelt down beside him, on the frozen ground, not in front of him, beside him. She picked up his cloak from the rock where he'd left it, draped it over his shoulders, fastened it at his throat. Her fingers were cold, precise, familiar. She fastened his cloak the way one fastens a child's, without fuss, without words, with the natural ease that comes only to people doing something very simple and very important. He felt the warmth of the cloak, the weight of the fabric on his shoulders. He looked at her. She looked at him. A weather-beaten face, long arms, rolled-up sleeves, even here, even at the edge of the fault line. Her sleeves were rolled up, because she was working, always working. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes, and she could see it in his. Wren approached. She stood beside him, silently. Her knives were sheathed, her hands at her sides, her face calm. She stood as a warrior stands beside the one she has chosen to protect to the very end. Not by order, not out of duty, by choice. She looked down at Ian. In her dark eyes was something he hadn't seen in all those months. Not tenderness, not admiration, pride. The simple, straightforward pride of someone who hadn't made a mistake in their choice. She nodded to him, once, briefly, the way one nods when everything has been said. Lyra closed the manuscript, the last page, the last line. She put a period. She closed the inkwell, blowed on the page, waited for it to dry, closed the cover, pressed it to her chest. Everything Ian had done today now existed on paper. Every step, every layer, every movement. The method, the sequence, the mistakes, the corrections, everything. If Ian were gone tomorrow, the world wouldn't lose what he knew. If a new rift opened 100 years from now, someone would open this book, read it, and try. And maybe they'd succeed. Lyra looked at Ian, his sharp mouth, his intelligent eyes, wet. She didn't wipe them. She was smiling. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, not sarcastically, not ironically, she was just smiling, like someone who'd just finished the work of a lifetime and realized it. Hannah was on her knees, hands on the ground, eyes closed. She was smiling too, quietly, the way people smile when they return home after a long journey. The earth beneath her palms was clean, warm, not from corruption, from life. The kind of life that begins to return when a wound heals. She raised her hands, looked at her palms. Clean, no burns. The riverbed doesn't burn. The riverbed guides. She looked up at the sky, at the snow, and said one word, quietly, in a language Ian didn't know. A word from the convent, from the prayer the nuns recited before work. Ian didn't ask what it meant. It sounded like a word of thanks. Seryn stood 3 steps away, as always, just like on the first day she arrived in Coldford. She stood there in silence. The voice that had just closed the rift was silent. She looked at Ian, at his graying temples, at his scorched hands, at the blood on his face, at the cloak Eileen had draped over his shoulders. She didn't approach him, didn't reach out her hand, didn't call out to him, because she finally understood, truly. Not with her head, not out of guilt, with her whole body, that whether to approach him or not was his decision, his right, which she had taken from him once by calling him a shadow, and which she would never take away again. She stood 3 steps away and waited, and if he said, "Go away," she would go away, and if he said, "Stay," she would stay. And both options would be right because it would be his choice, not hers. Holt stood at the edge of the plain. His sword was lowered. His face was wet, not from the snow. He looked out over the plain, at the bare earth, at the snow settling in an even layer, at the people in a circle, at the pale man in the center with gray temples. Holt had fought for 20 years. He'd buried friends. He'd buried his wife. He'd kept up appearances. He'd written reports into the void. And now this. The earth breathes. The snow falls. The rumbling in his bones has stopped. For the first time in 10 years, he stands on northern soil and doesn't feel that constant tingling in his teeth that everyone in the unit had come to accept as normal. He stood there and cried, openly, without shame. He's 50 years old. He's earned it. Ian sat in the snow, his cloak draped over his shoulders, snow on his hair, white on white. He pulled a pebble from his pocket, Maya's pebble, smooth, round, a river pebble, warm. She had held it in her fist to warm him while she waited by the hill, and it had retained its warmth. A small stone, a small hand, a little girl who draws maps with colored chalk and who, 4 months ago, wouldn't open her eyes. He clenched the pebble. He thought of her, of how she'd give it back to him, today or tomorrow, when he gets there. She'll be standing at the gate. She always stands at the gate when she's waiting for him, with her back straight, with a serious expression, with her hands behind her back. And he'll give her the pebble and tell her he's back. And she'll nod, and take the pebble, and say she knew, that she'd always known. He thought of Eileen, of how she'd sit next to him that evening at the cafe. At that very same table, the one that feels cramped when it's crowded. And she'll pour him some tea, hot, without St. John's wort, and he'll say thank you, and she'll nod, and they'll sit there in silence, and that will be enough. He thought of Wren, of her dry remarks, of how she brought him hot water that first morning and didn't say a word, about how she got angry on his behalf when he wasn't angry for himself. He thought about Lyra and her book, about how the knowledge of the Ravenlocks would not die, about how Lyra had done the impossible. She'd turned 6 generations worth of scribbles into a system anyone could understand, about how, for the first time in her life, she'd done something that would outlive her. He thought of Khan, of the monastery that no longer existed, about the woman who had followed a trail for 2 years and found not a weapon, but a way to heal a wound, about how her teacher would have been pleased. He thought of Seryn, 3 steps away, quiet, waiting, different. Not the girl from the living room who said he was a shadow. Different. The one who stood in the circle and sang in the voice of her clan for the sake of the land her clan had helped to curse. The one who spent 5 months washing dishes and studying herbs without complaining. The one standing 3 steps away who isn't come closer because she understood. He didn't know what would become of them, of him and her. He didn't know if she would ever fully forgive him. He didn't know if she would want to. But he knew it was his choice, and that was enough. He thought about himself, about Ian Ravenlock, 23 years old, graying temples, sun-scorched hands, a dry cough, a body that was aging faster than it should. The men in his family didn't live past 50. Maybe he'd make it to 40, or 35, or 50. He didn't know. But he knew that the years he had left would be his own. Not years spent as a silent vessel for someone else's pain. Not years as an invisible groom. Not years as a shadow. His years, with his people, on his land. He stood up, slowly, with difficulty. Eileen took his right arm. Wren stood on his left. He took a step. His knees were shaking. A second. A third. He held on. They held him up. He walked. Each step was easier. Not because his body was recovering. Because he was walking home. To Coldford, where above the herbalist shop there's a room with a crack in the ceiling, where 2 of Maya's drawings hang on the wall, where there's a table that's a tight fit, where it smells of mint and fresh bread and dried roots, where someone sets out hot water on the porch in the mornings, where they're waiting for him. They walked across the plain, 6 people and 15 soldiers, across land where snow lay for the first time in 200 years. Not heroes from ballads, not knights in shining armor, a herbalist with rolled-up sleeves, a scout with 2 knives, a nun with black beads, a chronicler with a manuscript pressed to her chest, a singer with red eyes, and a curse-caster with gray temples, who was not walking where he needed to go, but where he wanted to be, and both of these places were one and the same. Snow was falling, quiet, even, white, settling on the ground, on their shoulders, on the hair, on the tracks they left behind, the tracks of 6 people in the pristine snow. And for the first time in 23 years, Ian Ravenlock wasn't thinking about someone else's pain, not about duty, not about guilt. He was thinking about how he wanted some tea, hot tea, in a mug that Eileen would set down without asking, and about how that was freedom. Not a sword, not glory, not a crown. A mug of tea in a warm room, next to the people who chose him, with their own 2 eyes. But he is alive and heading home to Coldford, to the people who chose him, to the table where there's barely room to sit, to a mug of tea, to the life he chose for himself for the first time.